Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council, networking workshop. And of course, everyone who's here, and I'm sure those who are watching online, a big welcome to you all, by the way, will know that it's for the North Atlantic Fiddle Convention and people associated with it and interested in the work that we're doing, and people who just enjoy playing instruments and being part of the overall world of fiddle playing and dance. That's what we're about. But our workshops are more specific than that. Our workshops are about trying to understand different ways that we can raise our research focus. And a few months ago, last summer, we had a very interesting workshop, our first workshop, looking at the ways that cognitive psychology might help us in our research focus. Well, today we're tackling a new area with someone who will be a great help, and the area is digital humanities. Now, I've got a few domestic things to mention before we sort of get underway. And the first thing is to tell you that obviously we are live streaming, but you all knew that. Tomorrow we will be also having filming and photographs taken and so on. And if anybody is not happy with that, please let me know, or Jenny know, who sat at the back. Jenny is our NAFCo AHRC networking coordinator. That's her short title. And the other person you could let know is Heather, who is the co-investigator for the whole research project as well, Heather Sparling. We have a Twitter feed that if anybody who is tuning in, live streaming, they can access and they can send comments, questions, etc. through the Twitter feed. The actual place is at official NAFCo, but the Twitter feed is hashtag NAFCo Workshop 2. Hashtag NAFCo Workshop 2. All lowercase, no punctuation, of course. Okay. Now, I mentioned photography and filming. We have a PhD student with us, Georgia Broughton. She's from UCLA, as is our keynote speaker. And her dissertation fieldwork, she says pre-dissertation fieldwork, maybe proto-dissertation fieldwork, who knows, examines Scottish traditional music and nationalism, and she's here today to observe the discussions addressing the intersection of folklore and technology. Where is Georgia sitting? There you are. Thank you so much. Okay. So Georgia will tell you all about her work, and if she approaches you, of course, she will have all the ethical bits and pieces she needs to do her work, which is great. Now, I think we've had enough introductions. Most of you know where the facilities are around here. Tea break and coffee break is through the glass wall there, so not far away. And I think it's time for me to introduce our guest speaker for this afternoon, the man who's going to get the ball rolling. And it's Professor Timothy Tangherlini, Tim. And Tim is from UCLA, where he's a professor of folklore, a very rare commodity these days, professor of folklore, but he's right up our street because we're about the only department only institute in the UK that uses the F word, you'd be interested to know, and we are very proud of it. He teaches in the Scandinavian section at UCLA and in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. His recent work has been on computational statistics, so we're going to find out plenty more on that area. He coordinated and put together a special issue on computational statistics for the Journal of American Folklore. You don't know the number, do you?
No idea.
Don't worry.
No, yeah.
We'll find it. What year was it?
Last year.
Last year.
Yeah.
So it's bang up to date.
Yeah.
He's an expert on Danish folk tales, legends, and other stories. And he's got published a book about it and also an online resource, which I think I'm going to have a good look at. It's called Danish Folklore Nexus. Sounds good. In the past, he's published work, research on talking trauma, and that, I think, fed into your public lecture you gave last night, didn't it, Tim? Right. Interpreting Legend 2015, another of Tim's publication, and he is the man we all need to have a word, because he's found out how to get money out of Google. So there's a challenge. So we could all learn a thing or two from that, I'm sure. Anyway, please could you give Tim Tangherlini a very big warm welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for that very nice introduction. I hope I can do it justice. Thank you for all attending. Thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to be here. When I was asked to talk at the North Atlantic Fiddling Convention, I thought, it's another situation where people have got the wrong Tim Tangherlini, because I don't know anything about fiddling. And I apologize for that right up front. I do fiddle with computers, hence the title. And I've worked a great deal with large archival collections, and I think that's what I decided I would talk a little bit about. How can we find our way through these large archival collections? Are there ways to navigate, and are there ways to discover patterns that are latent in these collections that we might not be aware of? So I think of folklore as perhaps the first of the big data fields in the humanities. And I say that because, not only because I'm wearing the wrong glasses and cannot actually read my notes off of my computer, but so I'm going to actually have to read this and try and triangulate with my notes on my computer. I hope that's okay. I say folklore is the first big data field because we have millions of variants. We have tens of thousands of informants. We have entire cultural regions that have been collected from and have been described. And we have a huge amount of historic, well, huge or huge. We've got a relatively large historic scope. So we can do things that are actually quite hard to do in other humanities disciplines if we can harness the power of both big numbers while keeping in mind the importance of very, very small numbers. Actually, I hesitate to call it a big data field. I kind of actually think of folklore as a medium-small data field in the context of what really is big data. But in the humanities context, when we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of stories, that's not anything that you can remember as an individual. And so we can use computational techniques to assist our thinking and to assist our navigation and to discover patterns that we might either suspect are there or not know are there at all, if we can put it together in the right way. Folk music traditions are a little bit more complicated to work with because these are time series data, and so they're dynamic data. That's a challenge to a lot of the techniques that have been developed for more static data. Nevertheless, there are certain approaches that we can take that might help us tease out not only patterns of the musical performances themselves, but the musical performances and repertoires and individuals who move through the landscape and move through their cultural areas, performing and learning and expressing themselves and expressing through that expression part of their culture. So I think we're on the cusp of being able to explore what we're calling culture analytics at a scale hitherto unimaginable. So we have all of these great resources, and people have been moving towards digitizing them, making them machine actionable, making them consistent in data format, and that is the pre-work that's necessary to be able to move into the analytical work that is not going to be the end unto itself, but is rather going to feed our research questions, and it's going to support some of the suppositions that we make, and it's going to support our research. I tend to not see digital, I don't even talk about digital humanities. I usually talk about computational tools for the assessment of humanities problems, because I think the heavy lifting really starts after you've gotten your results. So the interpretation of the results are much more important than getting the results themselves. Nevertheless, it's a necessary step to getting to the interpretation is to get results that you can trust, that you have confidence in, and that are based on reasonable data. There's a very well-known expression, garbage in and garbage out. Actually, it's more colorfully expressed in other places, and I see that a lot when I work on my own stuff, and I see other people working, because getting that data in the right format and having confidence in your data is a very big step. I always present this little working definition that I have of folklore so people can understand where I'm coming from. You all know this. Folklore really emerges from this productive tension between individuals and tradition. I think it's very important that we keep the individual in there. All my work has been focused on repertoires and the individual and how they have a relationship to the broader dynamic tradition group in which they participate. And all of this takes place on social networks. Right? So folklore is really cultural expressive forms circulating in and across social networks. Well, that's a huge leap, just that recognition, because it means that all of network analysis is now available to us to help us understand the complex environments in which we work. So now we've got these wonderful cultural artifacts, which we can think of as stories or songs or performances, but we also have the social network dimension to it. And if we recognize that those social networks are embedded in time and place, now we have a really nice, complex model that perhaps can give us some useful information over whatever domain it is that we're interested in. So I want to know, how can we work with this type of complexity so that we don't lose sight of the individual tradition participant? Because there's a tendency to elide the individual when you're working with such large-scale data. How can we include the context in which they engage with other people, their audiences, the other tradition participants, without whom you can't have tradition? I always have my students do that little thought experiment. Does tradition have a life of its own? Of course it doesn't. If there are no people around, there's no tradition. And then we recognize the larger context of traditions in which these performances emerge. And so that brings us into the historical and geographic dimension. So that's a complex problem. Conti Berna at Indiana proposes using this idea of the macroscope. And the macroscope is something that I thought of as a very productive idea. And so I kind of stole it with her permission and have been talking about the Folklore Macroscope, which provides us with this vision of the whole. Synthesize related elements, detect patterns, trends, and outliers, and still having access to these myriad details. So we want to be able to have the satellite view, we want to have the meso view, and we want to have the micro view. And we want to be able to move between those scales where you get something at the macro level, and you say, that's an interesting pattern, how far down can I drill? I want to be able to drill all the way down to the original recording. And then I find something in those original recordings, I say, oh, what does this look like at the level of community? Or what does this look like at the level of, a decade? What happened in this area over the course of a decade? And if I can integrate those different levels, then I've got a model of complexity that allows me to work with this material without losing sight of the fact that these are people. And at the same time recognizing that these are people who are part of larger dynamic communities. And so I've found that idea of the macroscope to be incredibly fruitful in my own thinking. So today's presentation, I want to start imagining some of the parts that go into a folklore macroscope. So what do I need to realize this vision? Some people might, in my darkest hours, I think of it as a hallucination. But what do I need to do to make this possible? What kinds of data do I need? How would I structure it? And what kinds of things could I do once I've got working parts of this macroscope? So I've got a bunch of experiments that I want to share with you today. One is the Danish Folklore Nexus, which is about curating and navigating a subset of a very large folklore collection. I want to understand how field collections come into being. And so we did a lot of work with trying to trace the roots of a folklore collector in late 19th century Denmark. Where did he go? Who did he talk to? How did he get there? Why did he go there? Why didn't he go there? And what does that tell me about the representation of a tradition area? what kind of ideological considerations are embedded in that, and what kind of personal considerations are embedded in that. Where do we choose to do field work? How do we choose to do field work? All of those things start to perhaps come out. There are a lot of classification problems in folklore. So one of the underlying problems in folklore is labeling things. It's pretty much the history of the field. What is this thing? Oh, this is a proverb. I'll put it over here. What is this? Oh, this is ATU type. Well, before you can even get to that, it's like, I need an index. I will call it the AT index. Why? Because my name is Thompson. Okay, so here's a folktale. Where do I put it? I put it over here, AT 310A. Then somebody comes along and says, I am Uta. I will put my initial at the end too, and we'll call it AT 310B. Okay, so now you've got all of this labeling of types. How confident am I in that labeling of types? What's a type? Right? So these are really fundamental questions in folklore. And are there ways to make classification more flexible? Can I make classification something that's driven by my research questions rather than my research questions align with the existing classification? That's where we've been for a very long time. It's like, I'd like to do this kind of research. It's like, okay, good luck with that, but it's much easier if you do this because we've already indexed it according to these premises. What if I can throw that not away, but put that in the background and say, I want to classify according to different criteria and see what comes out? So we did a lot of, or we still are actually doing a lot of experiments in multimodal network classification and other types of classifiers that take advantage of what we already know, but also take advantage of statistical methods for surfacing things that we actually don't know until we surface them. I'm very interested in geography. I think the geographic method or the historic geographic method in folklore got a very bad name very early on, and people abandoned geography. I think that's a shame because with modern GIS techniques, we can start to surface geographically relevant patterns. And they might tell us something. They might confirm some of our suspicions, but they might give us leads to something that we weren't aware of. And I'll show you some experiments with that. And then working with dynamic data, this is really something that I started working with about a year ago. It's incredibly difficult to work. Hats off to you guys, you're working with music. Oh my God, that's hard to work with. So I've been working a little bit with that. I finally got something working about 2 weeks ago. Georgia has given me some very good insight into what exactly it is I've got working. I'll show you some of that at the very end, and we can see if that's a worthwhile experiment and a way to perhaps search through very large collections. So before we get going, I want to tell you a little bit about the field collection that I work with most. There's a Danish collector, Evald Tangherlini. He wandered about mostly Jutland for about 60 years, 50 years really, 1870 something, 1873 or so to about 1923. And he collected assiduously. At the end, his field diaries were about 24,000 pages that looked like this. And he published excerpts of them in 80 volumes. And how he did this, here he is, Evald Tangherlini. He wandered about the countryside, mostly on foot. He published excerpts in these books that you see there on my bookshelf, about 80 volumes. And all of those field diaries were collected on these field trips that he took throughout Denmark, where he visited places and talked to people and recorded what they told him. And then he wrote his memoirs. His memoirs are actually a weird reading experience. They're based on letters he sent home, allegedly to his wife, but they don't read like letters to your wife. They read like, I went here, I talked to so-and-so. They're letters to himself, masquerading as letters to his wife. And the only thing that really is addressed directly to his wife is, could you please send a package of clean underwear to Skelby because I've run out. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these letters, and they're in 4 pages of the dullest reading ever. called his Mine Oplevelser, or basically just his memoirs. This turns out, and nobody's ever indexed it. In fact, at the very end, he writes in the last paragraph, he goes, you know, it would be really great if somebody would index this thing. I'm not going to do it. I'm too tired. Period. That's the end of his memoirs. And I encountered that about 17 years ago, and I thought, how would you index this damn thing? And so actually that became a pet project, sort of indexing this. And as we worked along, we discovered that he had actually written out all of his field collecting routes. So we mined his field collecting routes from the memoirs that were based on these letters to help us describe how this fieldwork collection came into being. So that's getting at an understanding of how this collection came into being and its scope. So that's what I've been working on now forever. 1987 I started working on it, so it's 30 years. And he took him 50 years to make it, and it's taking me 30 years just to index the damn thing. Darn you, Valentine Christensen. But I found it incredibly productive. Not only have I learned a lot about storytelling and ballads that he collected, but I've also learned a lot about fieldwork methodologies and how they develop. And I've learned an awful lot about the concerns of small holders, cotters, living out in the countryside at the time of the greatest economic, political, and technological change that Denmark has ever seen. So when he starts collecting, there are no trains, for example. By the time he finishes collecting, the train system is more built out than it is today. When he starts collecting, there's no real forms of telegraphic communication, and by the end, the telephone exists. So there are all sorts of technology changes that are happening, and there's all sorts of reforms in agricultural organization that's also happening. So that influences greatly our understanding of these storytellers. So one of the things I thought as I started to put this together, the Danish Folklore Nexus actually, was to say our navigation has to add value. How can I move through a collection in a way that isn't purely topic based? I've always been interested in storytellers and their relationships to the stories that they tell. I've also been interested in stories that have relationships to each other that are not solely based on a shared appearance of a witch. Maybe they share a place name, or maybe they share some other type of relationship between actants that isn't immediately apparent. I've also been interested in looking at time and geography. So if there was a way that I could, for example, study Jens Christensen and see the field trip on which he was met by Tang Christensen, and see all of the other places Tang Christensen visited on that field trip, and perhaps have a picture of Bidde Jens Christensen, and maybe develop a biography of Bidde Jens Christensen, and then also have a chance to look at all of the places that he mentions in his stories and map those places and get a sense of the geographic reach of his repertoire. I thought, wouldn't that be cool? And I answered that. I said, yeah, that would be cool. And then the next question was, well, how do you do that? And the answer was, I have no idea. And then we started to sketch this out, figuring out ways to represent a repertoire that would also give us access to all of the other repertoires that make up the collection, and all of the field trips that make up the collection, and all of the place names that make up the collection. And to be able to drill down and get a biography of these different storytellers and look at where they lived, not only with contemporary maps, but with historical maps that I could move back and forth so I could see the difference in land use and how that changed historically. So that felt to me like I was getting towards a thick descriptive environment for the study of these storytellers and ballad singers, and he's a spilleman. He's a fiddler as well. I wish I had recordings of his. He was apparently a very adept fiddler. And then I wanted to say, well, now that I've got these sort of repertoires situated in context, now I want to be able to drill down into the stories themselves and find it in the order that it was told to Tang Christensen and when he recorded it. Because I think there's something that happens when you go from story to story to story. And when we read stories in a collection, there's no way that we're ever going to get the order in which they were told. But I can do that now, right? I can go back to the field diaries and say he told this story first and that story second and that story third, and I can present it here. I thought maybe I should also be able to present it in the Danish manuscript original and in the published version. So maybe you could get a sense of editorial practice. How did that influence what people thought was being told and what was actually being told? Maybe I could write an annotation. Maybe I could find related stories that are not based on a topic classifier, but are based on a multimodal classifier. So there are lots of different features that go into this classifier and allow me to find stories. And so we did that as well. And then I thought, a lot of people are probably suspicious of my ability to transcribe Danish. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice to actually show the manuscript pages too, so you can check my transcriptions? So you're welcome to do it because it's right there. We've got all of the manuscript pages there as well. And I don't know, I generally think I'm pretty good. So that's the Danish folklore nexus. There's actually, you can actually visit it. I'll make available online a download as long as you promise not to distribute it too widely, since it's part of a book. I'll actually give you a link so you can download the full Nexus. It's a little bit heavy. Then you can just install it locally on your own computer. It doesn't need the internet, but it's happiest when the internet is on. You get better maps. But when the internet is off, that was one of the design features. I wanted people to be able to access all the material while the internet was off. So this is the actual existing folklore nexus. You can see you can bring up the historical maps. And there are lots of different ways to navigate the material. I don't think I have time to go into all of the navigation, but if you'd like a demo of it, I'd be happy to do that as well afterwards. So then the question was, for the Nexus, I was only using a tiny little corner. I could only translate about 1,000 stories. And not lose my mind entirely. And so I focused on 5 main storytellers, and I put them into this rich environment. But that included annotations and translating into English twice. And that's a lot of work. So for research purposes, I was also interested in how did the fieldwork collection come into being? And so with Georgia and a group of other colleagues and students, we started mapping all of these fieldwork routes. We had no idea how many fieldwork collecting trips he had gone on. And we actually had to do all sorts of different things to figure out where it was that he was visiting and what the population density was. One of the immediate worries that we had was that he was just visiting places where people lived. And he would go to the places where people lived, and so we had to come up with a way of representing population densities in Denmark, and then look at stops per parish or district per thousands of people who lived in those parishes or districts to make sure that we weren't, or that he wasn't, well, we weren't misrepresenting what he was doing. And so we started working, first of all, with population data to try and see where it was that people lived in the 19th century in Denmark, and align that with parish and district level, what do you call those, shapefiles. And then we wanted to see where it was he went. And we discovered that he visited 1,835 different places. almost 1,300 of those places were unique visits. He only went there once. But 543 places were places he went back to. So he was interested in finding people who were craftsmen of the tradition. He would revisit them. And so, a second order question would be, what characterized those people? Were there certain classes of people? Were there certain types of things that they performed well that he was interested in? And so that's a second order question that we can now start to answer. So we can recast this repeat visit count to eliminate places where he lived, large cities, transportation hubs, and then we can also then start to recast it in different ways. Now that's kind of an interesting map. There's some things that immediately jump out. He never went to Les Sur, which is a shame because they have delicious salt on Les Sur. He spent an awful lot of time in Eastern Jutland, visited there a lot. Very interesting, actually, because he always says, I'm a West Jutlander. All of my folklore is collected in West Jutland. West Jutland is where the true Danes live. It's like, dude, I don't know. This is West Jutland. You went there, yeah, you certainly did, but look at all of this in here. And of course, that was political reasoning, right? He wanted to get money for his collections. And it turns out real Danes live in West Jutland, and so he could get more money to collect in West Jutland. He was playing on the right wing, actually. It was the right wing that was really interested in funding research on real Danes. And so these are some other types of maps that we started to do. And you can see this incredible concentration in northern Jutland and this area of Jutland here. And one of the things I started to recognize, or we started to recognize in the group, was that there was something interesting about this, because he's not collecting here because nobody lives there. That's the heath. And he's collecting on this area here because that's where the train goes, right? And so the train, this technology of transportation, profoundly impacts where he can go and what he can do. And so we can also see that as his collecting career progresses, he starts to revisit people, right? And so this is probably something you all know from your own fieldwork collecting. Once you've got some good informants, you keep going back to them. And so we can see early on there's some repeat visits. This is all near where he's living. And then later on, the repeat visits is an upward trajectory. And so if we were to fit a line to that, we'd see that he's more and more repeat visits. To by the end, around 1914, all of his visits are repeat visits. He's only visiting people that he's met before. We can also start grouping the trips. We can group them by year, by where he lived, by month, etc. And I think that's kind of interesting. It gives us an idea of fieldwork practice. A lot of times we forget that there's a fieldwork practice behind all of these collections that we're working with. How did these come into being? When would you be likely to go there and not there? Were there weather considerations that you had to take into account? Were there work considerations that you had to take into account? And so we can start to tease that out of the data, even though he doesn't really talk about that. So we thought maybe there was going to be a huge spike in the summer months. And there is quite a bit of collecting activity. June is his favorite month to collect in. The sun is up pretty much all the time. People have already done the plowing and seeding, and they're not really too worried about weeding just yet. He's a school teacher, so he's off. He's not teaching at that point. And he can go further afield, so to speak, in June. So that makes an awful lot of sense. We weren't expecting this relatively high number in December, January, and February, because you think the weather sucks, it's dark all the time, but remember, he's collecting largely from day laborers and smallholders. They're all at home, they're all kind of shut in, they've got nothing to do. And while he's a teacher, it's easy for him to get substitute teachers in those months, and so he's going off with substitute teachers taking his place. We were surprised by April, and I have no clear explanation for why he doesn't travel anywhere in April. I don't know. Average distance per field trip, we see that weirdly, December is the month where he travels the longest distances. Again, not what we expected, but a suspicion is that he's taking the trains these long distances and then walking the short distances by foot. So there's some kind of skew going on there. So we wanted to think, how is he getting around? And so that became, that's just another breakdown. Oh, okay. Yeah, we wanted to look at modes of transportation. Before we did that, of course, we also wanted to see if there were different periods in his career when he was most productive. Now, a lot of people think that Tangherlini was under Sven Grundtvig's thumb and was really doing most of his collecting prior to Grundtvig's death in 1883 from dysentery. But you see that early on in his career, where he's mostly collecting ballads, he's really not traveling that far afield, and he's not really being that productive. It's not until Grundtvig dies that Tangherlini feels liberated and goes out and starts to collect the things that he really wanted to collect himself. Grundtvig wanted him to collect ballads, then fairy tales, proverbs, legends if he really had to, and then everything else. Tangherlini wanted to collect legends, everything else, ballads, but he was so mad at the music establishment in Copenhagen that it was almost like he was almost giving them the finger whenever he collected ballads or music, and then everything else. So his ideas were completely different from Grundtvig's, partly because he was informed, he knew what was out there because of his field work experience. And so we see this absolute explosion. 1884, Grundtvig dies. Look at this. The number of stops, it just takes off. So once Grundtvig dies, his fieldwork collecting explodes. That's astonishing. Transportation was something that we were really interested in. How do technologies of transportation influence fieldwork collecting? We like to think a lot of times, at least in Denmark, of the golden age of folklore and folklore collecting being from about 1790 to about 1860. But it turns out we've got to look past 1860, actually past 1864, 1865, and the war over Schleswig and Holstein, and the rise of the technology of transportation to see the real golden age of Danish folklore collecting. And that's the second half of the 19th century. And so we realized that getting around Denmark changes dramatically with the advent of the train. Before, at the beginning, he preferred to walk because he thought he would be then in closer contact both with the earth, but the people who worked the earth, and as we all know, that's the real folk. And so he prided himself on his ability to walk. Horse carts, he made frequent use of the postal wagons. He really hated taking the postal wagons because he had to pay money. He was not a very happy, he was not happily separated with his money, what little he had. He often would hitch ride with ministers, school teachers, and others. But he felt that that gave him a little less ability to meet people. Ferries and boats, he would use those to cross water. Makes sense. Denmark is a country of islands. That was actually turned out to be very difficult for us because all of the networks that we had, transportation networks, none of them had ferry lines. And so we had to do research to find out where the ferries had gone and where the ferries had been so we could add those to our transportation networks. Trains, we started playing around with the trains, and then bicycles. He could have taken more bicycles. He took a bicycle once in his life, hated it, said, I'm never going to do that again. So there's one field trip where he rides a bicycle. So we had to interpolate means of transportation. It's very easy to interpolate means of transportation over water. He took a boat. So that was easy. a lot of times it was hard to figure out if it was a ferry or some other thing. Ferry schedules can provide us with travel time. We're interested in how far could he go? How many people could he possibly meet? And what kind of influence did that have? When did he walk? When did he take a horse cart? When did he take the train? And so since we had 3 options, it was a little bit harder to figure out. Sometimes he says, I took the train. So then we knew that he had taken the train, unless he was deliberately lying. Since he knew that nobody was going to read his memoirs, I don't know why he would lie like that. I think there are 3 people, 2 of them in this room, who've actually read the memoirs in the world. I can't imagine anybody reading. Can you imagine anybody reading that, Georgia?
Well, I'm sure someone would.
Yeah. I made Georgia read large parts of it. She's never forgiven me. There's, he has to be able to get on and off the train. So we were wondering, when did he take the train? Because a lot of times he didn't tell us. So there had to be a start and stop point. This is our thinking. If he's going to take the train, he's not jumping off the train. There may be mixed transportation modes on a segment, and we assign a primary mode based on this model. Then we break the segments into portions based on the transportation mode. We use a 1 kilometer buffer around train stations, saying that, yeah, that's probably how far he probably would be willing to walk without mentioning that he took a train. And then after assignment, we find out that almost 20% of his segments that had not been assigned definitively were train routes. That means he's relying on the train an awful lot. And so here we find all of the places that he traveled by train once we have this model of how do we assign train routes to segments that he traveled. We also have a threshold for how far he could possibly have walked during a day. And that then gives us a really interesting view of how far he was going by train, how much he was using the train. Remember, when he's on the train, he can't possibly just stop and get off and visit an interesting village, right? So it really influences the scope of his field collecting. It gives him much further reach, but it interrupts the spontaneity that we see in his walking field trips. And then I think this kind of stuff is fun. I realize I'm like geeking out wildly on different possible transportation modes, but for me as a folklorist, I'm fascinated. It's like now I can really start to get close to what this field trip collecting was like and how he met people, right? Who did he meet? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take all of the school teachers in Denmark and we're going to put them in their schools. And we're going to look where they went to school and we're going to figure out his school teacher network, and then we can align that with this transportation network. And now we're getting towards really what I would call a comprehensive and thick description of a very, very large folklore collection. I think that would be a good model for us to understand how 19th century folklore collections, these giant national collections, how they came into being. I think that's, for me, that's very exciting. Hope it's vaguely exciting for you too. And so here we see what I think is fascinating is look how much he's walking at the beginning. Then he's not doing any collecting here. Gwynfig dies and he immediately jumps on the train. And now the train really takes off as his main mode of getting around, and it wildly increases the scope of his collecting. He's no longer just collecting where he lives. He's going far afield. He's meeting all of these people, and he's collecting all over Jutland. And that's why I think it's interesting that that stop map I showed you at the beginning follows so closely the train routes, right? Because you saw how much he moves toward using the train as a mode of transportation, and that means he's actually going to be following the train routes to get to places. That doesn't mean he's not walking. He's walking an awful lot. A lot of the segments he's walking on. And then he walks once he gets to a place, a destination he's interested in. And there are different ways of chopping up this data. Okay, so we've looked at a nexus, we've looked at curation, we've looked a little bit at navigation through a complex network. We've looked at transportation and how that has influenced the creation of a very large folklore collection. Now we've got all of the stuff. And like I said, we want to reclassify it. We want to do things with it that we haven't been able to do before. So that's another part of the puzzle. and hopefully these parts of the puzzle start to interlock so we get this rich, complex environment for the study of folklore. So here's a story. I should have started off with a story. People always say start off with a story. I forgot to. I apologize. But here's the story. It's the old counselor from Skopje. He comes riding on 4 headless horses to Talbia. He always drove out of the northern gate, and there by the gate was a stall. They could never keep that stall door closed. I know you've probably had this experience on your own farm. Don't do what happens next. They had a farmhand who closed it once after it had sprung open. One night after he'd gone to bed, something came after the farmhand, lifted his bed straight up to the rafters, and crushed him quite hard. Farmhand shuddered and asked them to stop. They said, "Nope, you've tormented us, so now you'll die." That's how 2 farmhands were crushed to death at that farm. He wanted to close the door. They never tried closing it again. Okay, so what kind of story is that? I'm going to say ghost story, right? Yeah, it's a ghost story. That's not how it's classified. It's classified in the... every time I tell the ghost story, you know, something like that happens. I could just stop telling these ghost stories. It's kind of freakish. Okay. Late that night, the ghost comes and lifts him up to the LED rafters. Okay. It's classified as a story about manor lords. So here's a problem. If I'm interested in stories about ghosts, and the classifier has put that over with manor lords, I'm never going to find it. Right? In the humanities, we have a tendency to do what we call 100% precision searches. We know what we're looking for, we find it, we're done. We miss out on recall, right? All of those things that could be interesting, but we just don't know about, maybe because they're indexed in a part of the collection that we aren't ever going to visit. So how can I increase my recall over a corpus like this? Well, here's a little toy model. We know that stories, here are 2 stories are told by the same person, let's say. Or maybe there's stories that are classified kind of together. They mention different people. They mention different places. They're told by different storytellers who also live in different places. This one happens to live in a place that he's mentioned in a story. That person lives in a different place. They tell other stories which maybe mention the same person or the same place, and they're all kind of connected that way, right? So you see all of these stories are connected on some level or another. Now, if I take that away, I've got all of these stories connected, but you would never know what's connecting them. Okay? So what if I could do that not just for 4 stories, what if I could do that over the entire corpus of stories? And yeah, you can. And you get what we call the story hairball. For anybody who works in network analysis, that's sort of like, okay, that's horrible. This red square up there tells me that initially there's no clear structure in this network. But I can use some math, and I can actually find structure in that network. Right? It turns out there is structure in that network. It looks sort of like that if I turn it into a tree diagram. It looks sort of like this if I've got giant balls of clusters of stories. And this strong diagonal there tells me that there's a clear structure in certain features of the stories. Right? So I can take as many features as I want. I can use that to connect them, and then I can untangle that hairball, and I can get to a structured network. What does that let me do? Well, I can dive down into that network, and I can see my story, which I've actually tagged with a sort of a radioactive tracker up there. It's ID 340. It's DS4 650. And I said, voila, there it is. It's in a different neighborhood. It's no longer in the neighborhood of manor lords. I'm thinking, oh, that's great. I wonder what neighborhood it's in. It's unfortunately in the neighborhood of butter. I'm thinking, butter? Butter? Ghosts don't like butter. Or maybe they do, but I've never noticed that before. Who likes butter? Nissa, the tomte, the brownie, likes butter. Like, damn it, this thing isn't working. Except, when I drill down and look at these Nisse, these are not normal Nisse. These are homicidal Nisse, who I've never encountered before. Never would have thought. Look at this. When they got home, the farmhand was happy because now he'd gotten something to use for fodder, and afterward Nis could go and feed the animals just as much as he wanted to. Then they got another farmhand. He didn't want to let Nis go on like that, but the farmhand got lifted up in his bed all the way up to the rafters, so he lay there dead in the morning when people got up the next morning. I never, ever would have found that without this type of network classifier. So I'm going from the very large down to the very particular, and now I've got a new research question. What's the relationship between ghosts and house elves? And that actually is a very interesting one. One that I hadn't really thought of before, but it has to do with inheritance, has to do with ownership, and it has to do with the farm and responsibility for the farm. So that's really cool, right? I got like goosebumps when I first did that. I was like, whoa. So you can actually use these techniques to find things, latent patterns in your data that you didn't know were there. And so we thought, that's cool. Can we do something even cooler? Can we attach that to the mapping that we were doing before? Of course, the answer is yes. So we started saying, well, we're going to reclassify all these stories. We have to label them somehow. But we're going to find a group, and we're going to label these witch stories. But we're going to take in all of those stories that also are part of that. It's not just a precision search, it's that with the recall. And now we're going to take all of the places that are mentioned in the stories, not where they're collected, but the places that are mentioned. I think places mentioned is something that we've overlooked. A lot of times when you see maps of folklore collections, you see where is it told? Well, it's like, well, that's kind of important, but what's even more important is about what it's about. Where is this place? We said, okay, well, let's give it a try with witch. So we came up with this project we call Troll Finder. The Norwegian troll security service was looking for some easy mapping things so they could help find the trolls. And we contracted with them. We did it for Denmark as well. Not many trolls in Denmark, but we found a lot of witches. We said, where are the witches? Yeah, I said, where are the witches? And it turns out, we did a little bit of statistical mumbo-jumbo stuff there. It turns out that the witches are in Grinneslev. Grinneslev? The hell's in Grinneslev? This is corrected for population density, and it's burning hot, right? It's like wildly overrepresented in the data. Grinneslev. I thought, Grinneslev. I've been to Grinneslev. That's what's in Grinneslev. It's like dull, it's flat, there's a church. It's like every other place in Denmark. What the hell is in Grinneslev that would make it burn so hot? Well, if we go to the Danish folklore nexus, we can just go right into stories about Grinneslev, and we see that the witches are supposed to gather on St. Hans Eve at Breum Spring, east of Grinneslev Monastery Church. Now, most of the stories don't even mention Grinneslev, right? They mention Breum Kilde, which happens to be close to Grinneslev. They go off to Troms Church. They dance. There was one who sat and played on an old horse's head. When they had good cats, I like that, when they had good cats, they could also ride on them over there. Not those years when they had the bad cats. Because of that, everybody in the neighborhood always marked their cats in their ears, because when they were marked, the witches couldn't take them. Sort of throwaway line about Grinneslev. Well, it turns out that Breum Kilde, Breum Kilde is the site where these two twins were accused of witchcraft in 1693. And they confessed. They said, yeah, we did it. They're like, well, we didn't tell you what you did. I'm like, oh yeah, no, but we did it. They're like, well, did you steal all the milk from everybody in the oh yeah, we did that. And they just like confessed to just about everything that a witch could possibly do. And so there were these twins, and they got prosecuted for witchcraft, and they got sentenced to death. Right, that's what you did with witches in 1693. Earlier that year, the king had sent out a note saying, hey, before you burn any witches, they've got a right of appeal to sort of the royal court here in Copenhagen. So any of those things where you're planning on burning witches, you got to send it over to us, and we've got to approve it. They didn't bother doing that. They just burned the witches right there at Breumkilde, at Grønneslev. Burned the witches. The king writes back to them and said, hey, you burned some witches. And they said, yeah. They said, didn't you get the memo? And they're like, oh yeah, sorry, didn't get the memo. Don't know what you're talking about. So they literally wrote back to Copenhagen saying we didn't get the letter telling us not to do that. So it's the penultimate witch burning in Denmark. There was a burning the year later, but that one actually went through the proper channels all the way to Copenhagen. Well, what's interesting is that none of that is mentioned in any of these stories, but that association with Grønneslev and witches resonates for 200 years through the legends, so that people have lost track of that original association, but Grønneslev is consistently associated with witches 200 years later, even though the story of these two twins is no longer part of the storytelling tradition surrounding Grønneslev. Again, I think these are the kinds of things, you get a result and you're thinking, I'm not going to get any results from this, it's just a bunch of stuff. And then you start to get these results, and it makes you rethink many of your presuppositions. It's like, oh, that's not supposed to happen. 200 years of association with something, a lot of folklore theories, like, it probably lasts maybe a generation or two, but 200 years, it sort of consistently, even though the story has drifted quite dramatically. Similarly, where did Tang Christensen collect? He collected in West Jutland, except that I can show you now that no, he collected where the trains were. And so we started looking at ways of doing this. So we used pre-existing labels, but we expanded those labels to take in things that weren't definitive. So our classifier is a multi-class classifier, even though we're using the pre-existing labels. And so we can look for where the hidden folk are in Denmark. They're everywhere. They're just hidden. That's why they're called hidden folk. We can look at two groups together, ministers and cunning folk, for example. And these are the biggest sort of hotspots or areas of significant debate over church direction, 1870 to 1890. So now we can actually say, these stories, even though they seem to be just related to cunning folk or just seem to be related to ministers, are probably also influencing local political conversations and decision making. And so I think these kind of tools become very powerful in that context. We also thought, what about conceptual geography? Where in the landscape do you find things? What if I put all of the storytellers standing on each other's shoulders, right? And use the distance and the direction to the places that they mention in a relative scale. And so we built these conceptual maps. It turns out that people tell stories about things that are close to them. So most stories happen within 10 or 15 kilometers. We can look at the direction. Mound folk or hidden folk are all around you, but they're just far enough away from your house, they're like out in the fields. Right? Well, that makes a lot of sense, but now we can show it. We can show it for 5,000 storytellers and 50,000 stories. 42,685 stories or something like that. So we can show it at a very large scale. We can do the same thing for, this is witches. Where are the witches? They're everywhere, and look how close in they are. They come right up to your house. So witches are a close threat. We can look at direction. Our test was strandings, stories about people who die, 5 minutes, on boats and things like that. And so it was good that we saw that all of the strandings happened on the coast, and that whenever people thought of people stranding, they looked out to the coast. Black Death as well. And that gets us closer and closer to this folklore macroscope, where you can always drill down and get to the underlying material. And now, shifting gears just a little bit, I wanted to look at folk music, because this is, in fact, a convention of people who are interested in fiddling. So I thought, what can I do in the context of fiddling? Dynamic data is really hard to work with. What I'd like to do is for any spillement or group of spillement, create an overall summary of their repertoire, create a similarity maps of songs in their repertoire, or a similarity of map of songs across repertoire. So let's say I had 500 songs. There are a lot of challenges. Which features are important? Which ones can I consistently measure? Which ones can I discern? Those are the ones that I'm going to use, the ones that I can easily get out of an MP3 file. So I'll grab those as features. Then I want to develop some similarity maps. The problem is that these feature sets are usually in very high dimensions. If I have a 3-minute song and I'm using 50 microsecond windows and I'm capturing 42 features per window, you can see that this goes up to many thousands of dimensions very quickly, but we can't see anything in anything more than 2 or 3 dimensions. So a lot of people have worked on this with sort of similarity maps and putting groups or songs close to each other in hexagon maps. This one I'm sure you've seen, the Last.fm self-organizing map, where they took all of the tags from Last.fm and made a self-organizing map using some GIS. They basically projected it into an imaginary landscape with a topography, and there you can see what folk music is close to, acoustic and things like that, indie singer-songwriter stuff. I thought that was cool. I thought this kind of visualization was even cooler because I could put my artists or songs around the outside, and then I could draw lines between songs that had certain similarities, which would increase my precision, increase my recall while keeping me, allowing me to maintain my precision. So the question is, how can I increase recall without sacrificing precision? These are kind of like these recommender systems. If you like this song, you might like this other song. So given a very large corpus of poorly labeled recordings, can I, given artists or recordings that interest me, discover additional artists or recordings that might also interest me? So this is what I did. I took 500 MP3 files of Danish and Norwegian and Swedish fiddlers. I converted them all to low bit rate, extracted a series of long-term features, blah, 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 ran some other stuff, pushed some buttons, and those are the features I chose. And then I created these visualizations, which I think are cool. Let's see what they look like. So that looks like spaghetti. You can't really do much with that, except that in this visualization, if I'm interested in an artist over here, I can click on it and I can see what other artists or what other songs they share similarities with in this multi-dimensional space. And then I can actually sort it using some other algorithms, and I can get rid of a little bit of that spaghetti. And I can see that one of the things we find is a lot of self-similarity. So these fiddlers are playing songs that sound a lot like their own songs, but occasionally they jump over to somebody else's song. So what I did was I took a subsection of those people, and I plotted them on a smaller map. I found a series of fiddlers that seemed to have a lot of crossover between each other. And I thought, well, I wonder what these sound like. And so here is one of my target songs. I don't know if you can hear this. Do we have audio on this? Obviously not. Is there an audio thing that I can turn up? Here, let's do this. And the classifier says, here's a song by a different artist with a different title, but according to these features that you've chosen, this one actually has some similarity. So as Georgia points out, you would never confuse these two songs. On the other hand, if you're interested in certain features, you might never find that song because it's sitting there in 500 songs that you don't know what are. So Georgia tells me that they're the same type of tune. They're both in minor keys. They're both polkas. The melodic line starts low and then ascends in a bell curve before returning to the root of the scale at the end of the last phrase. This is all George's wording. I can't say things like that. I wish I could. And then the dissimilarities in keys and differences in melodies with the interval jumps versus stepwise motion. Now that's interesting to me as even not knowing this, that I can find these songs that I otherwise wouldn't put together. Maybe there's something going on there that, maybe there's an influence thing, or maybe there's a tradition thing that's going on there. I don't know. That's why we need domain experts when we start developing these tools. I just used features that were low-hanging fruit. It's like, I can do this, I can get that. What features would you want, to emphasize? And we can reweight all of those features so you can get a classifier that allows you to expand the recall over what tends to be very precise. I know I want this artist, and this artist, or I know I want artists from this area. How can I get artists from other areas that can help me in my thinking? Right, so these are not deterministic, rather they're exploratory. And then once you have this larger corpus, then maybe you can start to do some things that support an argument. So this is increasing recall for research and performance. So that was something that I really finally figured out how to do last week. And I thought I'd bring it here because those visualizations allow me to imagine that space in a different way, and allows me access to a larger number of features than I can generally keep in mind at any one point. Now, I don't think it's probably as useful right now as our network classifier, but one could do the same types of things, is what I'm trying to say. So I wanted to put that out there to stimulate thought and perhaps also skepticism. So I want to thank a lot of people. A lot of people have been very generous to me over the years. And those are the people who I want to thank. And of course, also our Folklore HGIS team with Holly, Georgia, Martin, and Ida, and Pete Broadwell at the UCLA Library. You've been an incredibly patient audience. I know that I sped up really a lot there at the end. I wanted to get to that kind of cool thing that I'm like, wow, I got something to work. Which is usually not the case. I spend months and sometimes even years, banging on keyboards saying, that's not working, but this thing kind of seems to produce something. I don't know what it is, but it produces something. So I'll be happy to entertain questions. I won't answer them, I'll just entertain them. And again, thank you, Ian, so much for having me as part of this.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. There's a great deal to think about there, and I think you touched on quite a lot, which is absolutely 100% relevant to our research interests. So I'm very pleased with that, and some of the things you were showing us there were very helpful. I know a number of us have thought about these sort of things, and maybe some of us have actually tried to do our own sort of data analysis along the same sort of reaches, who knows. But I think we've about 8 or 9 minutes for questions, so I know we're running a little bit late. Anybody who's watching the live stream, we are definitely running late. Don't worry about it, we started late. So we'll have 8 or 9 minutes for questions. Byron, I can see you've got you're working one out. Your question's just there.
Sure. The question is, I suppose, a little bit about the technology that allows you to gather not stories in this case, but songs in this case. I didn't see the complete list of features that you were testing for. I didn't memorize them or read them.
Yeah. I mean, I can go back to them. They're not ones that, these are the low-hanging fruit. So this is a pre-existing audio analysis package that I kind of tweaked a little bit to give me something. Why is this not showing up? What have I done? I should be in PowerPoint, but I'm definitely not in PowerPoint. Okay, well anyways, yeah.
Sure. I was at a presentation just on the previous weekend where ethnomusicologists have been doing a very large sort of search through a bunch of MP3 recordings, of very old recordings, and he was comparing the beat range of the recordings to see whether the average beat of these recordings corresponded to a seeming universal preference for something around 100 beats per minute.
Okay, yeah.
Right, so he looked at all these recordings, or the team looked at all these recordings, and they found, yes, there was a cluster just a little higher than that. There's also a smaller cluster around 60. Now the question was, well, is this a kind of doubling of the higher number?
Right, sure.
Or could it actually be an older recording device that has a regular kind of
like a 60
impulse,
hertz, yeah.
right, at exactly a certain rate.
Sure.
So the measurement is picking up an artifact of the technology, which also tells you something interesting, of course, in the same way that that your information told us something interesting about trains and collecting. These kinds of the general gist here might tell us something about, say, the kind of microphones that people were using, the kinds of recorders that.
Oh, absolutely. And so, you know, things like, I wish I had all of those things, but so even things like dynamic range of the microphones, you might get a different spectrum, and you know, those are things that you can actually you can correct for on a large scale. So 60 hertz. I would love for there to be something as regular as a 60 hertz, you know, blunk, because that's really easy to correct for. Some of the things that are much harder to correct for are the acoustics of the place that you're in. But if you take enough features, you can say, oh, this feature that maybe is something like, I don't know even what you'd call it, but like sometimes you're recording in a room and you get some resonance to the room. Is there a way that I could deaden that resonance? There are ways of doing that, but now you're actually influencing the underlying recording. And so, you know, that's kind of, you're always trading off between, you know, data massaging. You have to do some things to your data. We do it with text all the time. We correct for OCR errors, and we correct for, which are basically recording errors. So we correct, you know, you correct for that, but that's also partly why I say these things aren't, these are fuzzy approaches to things. You know, when people start to say, the number is 8.2 plus or minus, you know, 2.5, I get very suspicious with humanities data. I'm trying to use these as a way to think, and I think that's great, where you start to say, wait, what's going on there with this weird pattern that we're seeing at 60 quote beats per second, right? Which is, you know, like a dirge or something like that, or 60 beats per minute. You know, and if it's consistent, then you can start to ask exactly those questions. And then now you've got a question about the change in recording technology and how that maybe influenced what was able to be recorded. Did I have to lug, you know, an old giant Nagra out into the field to do my recording? However beautiful and wonderful they were, they had limited capacity with battery life. Or, you know, am I recording with, you know, some, you know, right out of the box, you know, top end, you know, field recorder? Or am I doing what my students do, which is use those crappy, you know, recording on their telephone? It's like, okay, that is not what we were talking about in field work collecting class, but sure, you can use that. It just means that we're in that same area of garbage in, garbage out. But now we can actually understand the garbage. What generated the garbage? What fieldwork considerations might have led to garbage? And fieldwork is so messy and difficult and hard, and it's raining outside, and you didn't expect the roof to be corrugated aluminum, and now you've got bloom, 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 bloom on the roof, and you're trying to record a shaman chant, and it's like, okay, so that's not actually part of the shaman chant, but it's there, right? So yeah, you've got some great, those are great questions. I think we could work with those, though. I think you had your hand up before. I think you were the first.
I have a question from one of our streaming viewers.
Oh, great.
From Laura in Montreal. But you might have answered the first half of her question. She wanted to know about particularly mapping the fiddle tunes and what the low-hanging fruit were. But also she'd like to know what the pre-existing audio analysis package is.
Oh, it's Pi Audio Analysis. PY Audio Analysis. It's a Python package. It's very nice. I stumbled upon it. and it actually is a whole pipeline. And so if you can get your recordings into 16 very low sampling rate, monaural sound. So you're already doing something to whatever it is that you've got. You're reducing it, and then you're going to run these things on it. And then you can choose how big of a window you want. You can choose which features to turn on and turn off, and then you can choose how to average them. And then you get completely lost in this, and then you start all over again. And then, but eventually it works. It's a very nice package, very, very fast.
I think we had a question over here from Heather.
Yeah, so now that we're all inspired to do all this amazing work, what do we need to do to start doing things like this? So do you take a course in computing? Do you find a really good pal in a computing department? Do you, like, what's your...
Depends on what you want to do.
Okay.
Right? So mapping, you have to get your data in, well, I mean, the first thing you have to do is get your data in good shape and have a sense of what your data is. And so actually, weirdly, the music part, there's so many people who work on music because they're trying to sell it to you, that there are lots and lots of ways of taking different types of file formats and turning them into a consistent file format. You might not like the way it sounds at the end, but the computer is not listening to it that way. It wants a consistent data format stream in. Now, you can change some of these things. I said, you're like, well, I want the highest fidelity thing. You can do that as well. It just, that would require some programming to use a different file format. So I'm looking for things that are accessible. And so that's why that Python library just is like, wow, this is great. If you want to do mapping, you have to learn something about GIS, and then you have to learn something about place names and geolocation, and how place names are located, and how historical place names are located. Then you have to learn how to figure out how to get those place names without doing it by hand if you're working at a very large scale. Thousands of place names by hand is a very, very tedious enterprise. And then you have to learn a little bit about disambiguation. In Denmark, every place is called Mejlby. It's like 42 of them. So how do you know which one is which? Møllerup. Those are our Mejlby and Møllerup. It's like, damn it, another Møllerup. So a lot of those. If you want to do network classification, I think that's probably the hardest. That's not low-hanging fruit. That's a little bit harder, because you have to decide what features you're looking for, and then you have to decide how you're going to extract those features. And then you're going to have to decide how to weight those features. And then once you've got this, what's called a multimodal network, those are very hard to work with. So a lot of people throw out a lot of information to make it a single mode network, and then you can use what you know about matrices and algebra to do what's called machine learning on it. So that's probably the hardest thing right out of the box. It depends on what you want to do, but I'll be happy to if you've got questions, very specific questions, I can give you some ideas. So
I'm still trying to figure out what my questions might be.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think
Yeah.
what
So the first thing is to assess what you've got as data and what you can get, and then think about it, in this macroscopic way. What would be the nicest thing that I could do? What would be the coolest thing that I could do? How can I traverse my data in a way that nobody's done it before? Right? I want to slice it in a way that gives me a new view on the data.
Okay, so then let me ask the question this way then. So let's say I figure out what my question is, but now I don't know what I need to do to get that question figured out. Do I email you, or is
That's probably the easiest thing. Email me and we can work on it.
Okay, very good.
Email me. Yeah.
I think we've just got time for one more question.
Ian Fraser, I'm a fiddle player. My question is actually about your Danish project.
Yeah.
When you first started, you said it was taking you 30 years.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, if you were to now find this all that writing and all the
Yeah.
question and start now,
Oh.
will it still take you 30 years
No.
because you want to find more data, you'll go way beyond or will it be much quicker now? Because
It's way quicker now. I mean, we made the biggest gains over the domain in the past 6 years, right? So I mean, it really accelerated. Once I figured out what I needed and how to put it together, but since I didn't have a model to work on, it's not like anybody had digitized a giant folklore collection from the 1900s or 1800s before. It just hadn't been done. So what kind of tools did I need to do and know? And really the thing that helped me a huge amount was I spent a semester learning about machine learning at a Institute for Pure and Applied Math. How they invited me, I'm still a little bit puzzled, but they invited me to spend a semester there, and I learned a great deal about some of these topics, and then I was in close conversation with people who were interested in difficult problems that they hadn't seen before, and so that really gave it a boost. So I was able to imagine it in a very different way. So now when we add, we're gonna now I just tackled Tide, Just Matthias Tide from the beginning of the 19th century. That took me about 3 months to figure out all of that in the same type of format as Christensen. We'll probably move on to Grundtvig, but one of the biggest challenges is making sure that you've got data that's machine actionable. If you don't have that, I mean, that can take a long time to get. 85% of any of these projects is data acquisition and data cleaning and data massaging, and if not 90%. That's really the hardest part. The funnest part is putting it all together. It's like, woohoo!
Thank you, Tim. Do we have anything on Twitter or anything from texting at all? Okay. Well, I think we're about ready for a break, and refreshments are next door. Looking at the clock, I think if we be thinking about getting back in about 20 minutes at about 10 to 4, all right? And those of you live streaming, so we'll reckon to start 10 to 5 to 4. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Round of our NAFCo workshop. My name is Heather Sparling, and I'm the Canada Research Chair of Musical Traditions at Cape Breton University, and I'm the international co-investigator with Ian Russell on the AHRC grant that has helped to allow us to run this workshop and the previous one, and the third one will be at Cape Breton University in October on performance studies, and details about that workshop will be coming up very soon. So I'm going to be chairing this next session where we have 3 presenters giving us some of their research, and then we'll have Tim come back and talk a little bit about how he might bring his expertise into that project, or sort of a masterclass kind of environment, I think. So now I put him on the spot. Sorry, that's not what I did not mean to make it terrifying.
No pressure.
I only meant to say, sort of give some feedback on how that might, from Tim's perspective, how that research might go. But we're also still very open to questions from you here, as well as questions from people online. And I'll just remind everybody online, or if you feel like you want to do it via tweet from here as well, then we're accepting tweets, the hashtag NAFCo Workshop 2. So first up on the hot seat is David McGuinness. So David is the director of the group Concerto Caledonia, with whom he has recorded 13 albums, mostly of historic Scottish repertoire. And he is senior lecturer in music at the University of Glasgow. In 2007, he produced John Purser's 50-part series, Scotland's Music, for BBC Radio Scotland. And he's also been a composer for television and theatre, most notably for E4's teen drama series, Skins. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Heather. It was really nice to hear Tim talking about the limits of classification systems and the need, well, you didn't say that, I'm putting words into your mouth already, the need for their constant renewal. You always need to think about how we classify things, because I am not a folklorist. So why am I here? I'm not an ethnomusicologist either. I'm really not a fan of that term at all. I'm not even a musicologist. Hate that word, it makes me feel ill. What I will admit to is being a musician. I think that's a fair classification. And a musician who's interested in how tradition and history interact, the sort of creative tension between them, and how the results of that get put into practice, or can be. So what am I doing here? Well, I grew up in Glasgow. I went as an undergraduate to the University of York in the 1980s. And I went there to do maths, actually. Maths with music was a degree you could do there. And after about 4 weeks, I realized I was crap at maths. And so I stopped doing maths and did a music degree, and I was very young at the time. And I thought, well, at least I'll have 3 years it was in England, 4 years in Scotland, 3 years doing something that's fun. And then I'll come out and I'll be 19, and so what? It was in the days when education really was free here, which makes a big difference. I didn't find the culture of classical music particularly welcoming or attractive. So one of the things I got involved in, besides playing in the gamelan, was playing Baroque music on old instruments. We called it authenticity back then. It's now usually described as the historical performance movement. And the recording side of it was already in full swing, but it was still seen as something a bit extremist, a bit weird, sort of brown bread and sandals. One way of framing what that movement was about was that it looked at the classical tradition, which is, I hope I don't need to remind you lot, an oral tradition. It's only the repertoire that gets written down. Everything else is passed on orally. We were looking at that tradition and saying, hang on, these hallowed, privileged, state-subsidized musical practices don't actually square with what we know historically about the music. What happens if we try and incorporate some of that information? Does the music make more sense, or might it? And so people were reading old books about how to play and getting either old instruments or commissioning makers to make new copies, setting their instruments up in a historical way, all that sort of stuff. And part of the motivation, besides just enjoying the sound of it and the supportive culture of it, was to say to the classical music establishment, you think that through your tradition you have a divine right to this high culture, well, you're doing it wrong. There was a bit of moral high ground being staked out, rightly or wrongly. It was a deliberate rejection of received tradition. That was the key thing, I think, for me. Traditions were seen as something not necessarily to be trusted. They could just become habits that could do with being challenged. And actually, the historically informed performance movement became a rather habit-bound tradition of its own in due course, but that's another story. But I think that's why I'm interested in a sort of critique of tradition rather than studying of it. It's possibly also a result of being brought up in a fairly evangelical wing of the Church of Scotland, where the Word was the authority. Everything had to bow before the Word. That's probably ingrained in me somewhere. But broadly, history and tradition are different frameworks for looking at the past. Once something is handed on in a tradition, you're creating a relationship between the present and the past, whether you're conscious of it or not. And that creative tradition between these two, when they interact in practice, is one of the things that really interests me. Now, around the same time, when I was an undergraduate student, I was finding copies of the Gow fiddle books, the original books, and wondering about the bass lines in there. Nobody seemed to play them. If you did play them, they don't really work as classical music. That's not what they are. They don't even really work played in an early music kind of way. They don't make musical sense in that way either. So what were they, and why did no one really take them seriously? The received view that I got told from people playing this music within this tradition was either that they were drawing room music, or that they were, and I quote, crap. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, that might be true, it might not be, but there's hundreds of them. And you can trace evidence of a very distinctive style of accompaniment for strathspeys and reels within Scottish traditions from about the 1760s right through to at least the 1880s, the same style. And I see Ronnie Gibson, who's not here today, from this institution located something in Scott Skinner's notes about this very specific bassline style and how it's so important for dancing. So broadly, hang on. I finally got to do something about this in these years on this project called Bass Culture in Scottish Musical Traditions. The title is one clue. One of the ideas was to challenge the notion that the traditional part of any, or the most traditional part of any musical activity is the bit at the top, the tune or the song. That's the one that always gets the most attention. I thought, no, hang on a minute, that's not good enough. I want some attention spent on what happens underneath. The title is one clue. I think it becomes less true if you look at historical materials the further back you go. Some examples are the fact that harpers played with their hands the other way around, so the stronger hand, your right hand, was at the bottom doing the bass and the underlying structure. Barnaby Brown's work on the underlying structures within pibroch in particular, but pipe music in general, also evidence of how there's a different, you can think of this music from the ground up rather than the top down from an analytical point of view, and the further back you go in history, often the more it makes sense. But more broadly, I'm interested in what historical materials, now this is the key thing, from before the age of recording, which is not generally what folklorists look at, I know. What those historical materials can tell us about the development of what we now describe as traditions. So, in this project, which was very generously funded by the AHRC, and we had universities of Glasgow, where I am, and Cambridge, where Barnaby did his PhD, and the Royal Conservatory of Scotland, we had Karen Macaulay, their amazing academic and services librarian, as the music bibliographer of the whole project, which was great fun. My bit of the project, besides running it, was exploring printed sources, just to give it some manageable scope, of Scottish fiddle music between about 1750 and 1850. And the most interesting bit of it for me, after spending the 2 years in libraries, which was actually really good fun, was we made this album. Now, the album was only the kind of end product. The really interesting part of the process for me was taking a bunch of very experienced traditional fiddlers who were okay with being given Baroque instruments and Baroque bows, and looking at the printed materials and taking them seriously in terms of the detail of what's in them, and then learning from one another about how can we get this to make sense and get it to make sense for dancing as well. That for me was the really interesting process. I went back to a project, if any of you have run one of these AHRC things, you know there's a thing called Research Fish, where you have to online post everything that you did. And I checked the other day, and apparently we conducted 52 outreach activities and produced 15 artistic products. And I can't remember what the 15 artistic products were at all. But I can show you some pictures of some of the outreach activities. Because in the last few months, we, as they say, got the band back together, and we put on these Ceilidh nights in Glasgow, where we took the 18th century figures and the dances and the tunes and the way they were played, as far as we can tell, and put them in the context of a night of Ceilidh dancing in Glasgow in sort of basement venues, which was really, really good fun. And here we are at the end of March in Oranmore. The band are kind of up there, a little bit raised up, like you'd be in the 18th century, so you can hear them, and the sound comes over the top. And no PA, and a wooden floor, and lots of people having quite a nice time. Now, another outcome, just last month, that wasn't organised by us, Talitha Mackenzie organised the 200th anniversary ball at Edinburgh's Assembly Rooms for the 200th anniversary of Nathaniel Gow introducing the French quadrille to Edinburgh. And so we've got the same tunes, the same dance figures, the same music, in that environment and this one. Totally different experience. And there's sort of a reflection there of the different environments with where these same tunes and dances would have been performed in the 18th century. Obviously it's not the same, but there's something going on there which I found much more interesting than I thought I would. I just found it really exciting being in those two different environments with the same stuff. Here we've got a workshop at the Royal Conservatory of Scotland a few weeks ago. I really like this picture. I don't know how well you can see it. Alison McGillivray is in here in the middle with her cello on a piano stool, holding a bow under hand and demonstrating an 18th century fiddle bass line. And here we've got students some from the trad department, some from the strings department, and they've got their fiddles vertically and they're playing the bass lines with underhand bowing. And this is the best bit. Guy here playing the accordion, and he's playing the bass line with his left hand and holding a bow with his right hand, so he can so he's sort of bowing the accordion. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And by this point, we'd had them all dancing and taught them some tunes, and at this point, they're getting the hang of the bass lines. That was really, really good fun. Other outputs, all the academic stuff, journal articles, book chapters. Barnaby Brown's PhD thesis, I think, is nearly finished. And the key one today is this website, hms.scot. And I'm not going to give you a tour of it here because You can do that in your own time. What I have got, I left them in my bag, is lots of badges with HMS.Scot on, and I'll leave them somewhere at some point. Put them by the tea and coffee if you want an HMS.Scot badge. And what's on this site is relating to the Scottish printed fiddle sources between 1750 and 1780. No, 1750, 1850. There's a database of the sources. What is there and where is it? And then a whole collection of metadata on each source. We hadn't planned to do that, but it seemed necessary by the time we got into it, because there was so much stuff. And we thought, well, there's nowhere you can go and find out where it is or what it is, even on a very basic level. So that just felt like it was necessary. And then a selection of digitized material. Here we've got a bit of Brenner's first book of Scots Reels. And presenting digitized material gives you another whole set of issues to deal with, which we'll come to in a wee while. So I don't want you to sit playing with the website quite yet, but there's plenty of time for that later on. I'd like to borrow some headings from one of my colleagues at Glasgow, Professor Lorna Hughes, about the kind of decisions that you have to make in digitization projects. Just to give you some headings to talk about. And the first of those is, how do you select what you're going to digitize? The ideal criteria we had, well, we'd like to put up some books that are illustrative of what our research findings are. Something that's relevant to today's musicians, something that's going to get a bit of traction and is actually going to make a difference to how people do things, we hope. It's got to be clear and legible so that when you photograph it, it's clear what it actually means. Not already available online elsewhere. That's shifting sands, that one, because things are being put up all the time. No IP constraints on it, it's intellectual property, so copyright problems, that kind of thing. And can we deliver this much on time and within budget, which is your sort of overriding concern. So that's the ideal criteria. The ones to add to that, which are real criteria when you're actually doing it, is can you actually get hold of this stuff and get it photographed to sufficient standard? Will the people who own these old rare books let you have them and take them into a place to be properly photographed? Usually, no, they won't. And then the willingness of the key staff in the holding libraries to be involved at all. What really shaped which material we got digitized was one particular library had someone in charge who was so completely up for it and was just like, yeah, let's do this, let's make this happen. Look, we've got this wonderful collection, we want people to know about it. It was at Nicola Cowmeadow in Perth at the AK Bell Library, which is just the most wonderful. It all just sits on two shelves and it's huge and vast and wonderful. So, she realized, oh, hang on, if this is online, then people will come and see our stuff. It is an amazing collection. Okay, so that's how do we choose the stuff. Metadata. This is a big one. The original plan was, right, this is all notated music. We're not talking about recordings here. And there's a wonderful online, open source rather, protocol for machine-readable musical notation, which is, it just about encompasses every possible kind of musical notation you can think of. If you can think of any weird form of music notation, there's a way of doing it in MEI. You can find out more about it, music-encoding.org. It's very, very impressive and very deep. You can integrate many levels of information about the source into the data itself. You don't have to have separate, it can be built in with the same file that has the musical information in it. Now here we were talking, Tim was telling us about how you can analyze large amounts of data from a humanities point of view, at least large amounts of data. Makes that possible. Probably not by us as part of the project, but just making it available out there so that somebody else can pick it up and do some work. And from point of view of our website, you can render the code in music notation in lots of different ways. You aren't stuck with a graphics file at the end of it. You have something that can be rendered in lots of ways as a graphic. Let's see. This MEI is now being used, a company you might have come across, you might not, called Tido Music. They're making notation apps for iPad, particularly for edition paters. I think they're the biggest commercial user of this at the moment. Integrating the structure of 18th and 19th century fiddle collections into the hierarchical structure of MEI was quite a challenge, but somehow we did it. And what we planned to do was encode the first two bars and the last bar of every strain of every tune into the MEI files, so that you could do tune searches in lots of different ways, so that you could do some deep level analysis if you so desired. Now, it's the kind of thing. Now, Laura Risk, are you still watching online? I know you can we all say hi to Laura if she's in Montreal? Hi, Laura! Hi, Laura. She's been doing this kind of thing with fiddle tunes at McGill, but with her transcriptions of old recordings and analysing tunes and finding these amazing relationships between things that you don't expect, because when you can throw lots of data at the computer, it will show wonderful relationships. So, you see it says the original plan. We didn't actually do it. Why not? Well, there's a very telling photograph here. This is Karen Macaulay, who's at the front. And to demonstrate just how much data was involved in every single piece of music, she laid them all out horizontally in a spreadsheet and printed it out, and this is it. And as you can see, I've got quite a long table. You can sit about 8 people around my table in the office, and this more than covered the table. And this could become impractical. And this photo also captures a very particular moment in the project, which is we lost a key member of the team. Zoltan Komivesh here is grinning because he's just got a really cool job in London, full-time working for Edition Peters on Tito Music, which is also MEI. Great for him, fantastic. But I then had to deal with, I don't know if any of you ever have to deal with human resources in your institutions. Some are very efficient, some are really slow, some just make things very difficult. And I lost about 3 months getting HR up to speed on what the kind of person that we needed to take over from Zoltan at this point. When I posted this photo on the project blog, I put a little jokey caption at the bottom. I said, Luca looks glum at the amount of data he is going to have to code in MEI. It's Luca Guariento who took over. And you can see the contrast. Yeah, I don't have to do this anymore. Oh, hell. What on earth have I got myself into? And once Luca was appointed, before diving in and just taking over the project as it was run, we said, look, hang on, let's stop, let's evaluate everything. What can we do most usefully with the remaining time and resources? And in the end, we decided that we had to take the musical content out of the metadata. So all this careful planning on MEI had to go. Searching and analysis of the musical material wasn't possible anymore, so instead we concentrated on making the other metadata as easily searchable, and not just searchable, but findable as possible. I wish I'd made a list of all the data fields to show you. I haven't got time to show you, but anyway. But the things on the web, you can look. You can see what all the data fields are that we came up with in the end. We used Solr as our search facility, and we worked very hard on ways of faceting searches. So that you run a search. Say you run a search on the word real, that's going to turn up thousands of entries. But what Solr can give you is different ways of refining that search by tune, by book, by composer, there's a whole load of them. And that just gives you a simpler way to work your way through a whole load of data if you've got even a rough idea what you're looking for. Or it might bring up an unexpected list of things which are similar in ways you weren't expecting. The next thing that went wrong was having thought about sustainability. I'm going to whiz through here. When we started, the university's policy was to maintain digital resources indefinitely, only actually guarantee the accessibility of the site for 3 years, which now seems absolutely shocking. But back then, that was probably not bad. What I know we have now at Glasgow is at least one dedicated full-time member of staff, and all he does is keep legacy websites up and running and find ways to update them. And I think that's going to become a serious growth area for work, just keeping digital resources alive. This is a really embarrassing picture because, like I say, the next thing that went wrong was one key person within the institution decided that for the university to host our site would not be a good use of their resources because they would have to support, in fact it was Solr, it was a search technology that they didn't want to have to support. So that was quite a lot of wasted time trying to negotiate a way around that and eventually give up. At one stage, the images were going to be hosted in Glasgow, the search on an Amazon server, and the site itself with Islamic studies at McGill in Montreal, because we were just calling in favors from people. Can you do this? And eventually, this is the search server. It's in a corner of my office. And we check in on it regularly to check that it hasn't fallen over or, if the power goes out. which is just embarrassing. But I'm hoping that we'll find a solution. Well, we will have a solution. Finding a solution is easy. Actually having it and putting it in place takes a bit longer. So even a well-funded project like this all kinds of things can really drop you in it once you've got going. It can become very stressful indeed. I didn't quite get, this is another of Lorna's headings, use and reuse of data right either. I really thought it was really important that people could print the material easily to go and play the tunes. People still put things out on paper quite a bit. I don't, but I know some other people do. And what I was worried about was if I made it too easy, particularly to make PDFs of the material. There was one website in particular that I won't tell you which one, but you can probably guess, that I was wary was going to just wholesale lift everything and put it on their site unacknowledged, which is something that they do with projects like this. On reflection, I think I was too careful. In order to download for the images from the site, you have to zoom in and then you can download one page at a time, which is really annoying if you want a big load of stuff. And we just used the download thing that was part of the viewer that we were using. I think we could probably find a better solution for that, and that's something to think about a bit later on. Finally, what next? My brilliant PhD student, Aaron McGregor, has already built a database of manuscript sources of Scottish fiddle music from before 1750. It is vast, and I hope we can house that here because it sits beautifully beside one of the printed sources from 1750 onwards. It would be nice to build the tune list from all the sources that are in the database, and perhaps integrate some of the functions. Some of you will know Charlie Gore's Scottish Music Index, which is an absolutely brilliant thing online. Has its maddening features, but it's so wonderfully useful to be able to search tunes by their shape. And what we'd hoped to do with MEI was to be able to do that in a much more granular way, but we couldn't do it in the end. That's one possible. Another possible one would be phase 2A. For years before I even got back into academia, I was massively frustrated at how little we know about historical Scottish music at all. Our ignorance of our own musical history is shameful. And a lot of it is because you can't get hold of it. And some of that is because academics take so long to publish anything, because it has to be rigorous, and we have to demonstrate how clever we are. And actually, that's no use to musicians. They're not interested in how clever we are. They just want this stuff. Get it to them. And so the difficulty I have if this is what I really want phase 2 to be, is how can I get funding for that if it's not an academically rigorous project? Because if it becomes academically rigorous, it actually stops being interesting and stops being useful. So answers on a postcard, please, for that one. And the very last one. This will eventually be part of an application for a rigorous academic project, which is the history of Scottish music education. I don't think I was ever taught from a Scottish textbook on music, certainly in my school career, not in my university career either, which is odd given there's a rich history of music education in Scotland and actually lots of textbooks from the 1660s onwards. Besides the books, the really interesting one actually is this game. Now, the first ever patent held by a woman in Britain was for this game in 1801, Anne Young. It's actually 6 games in one in this game board, and it's to teach you music theory. And it should be playable by a child of 8 years old. No one's ever actually got the full instructions and a copy of the game together in the same place. And as you can see, it's a terrible picture. There's a copy there's a copy in Dublin. It's a very expensive bit of kit. Do you have to have even a replica of the expensive bit of kit in order to build the games? Or is there a way of rewriting them as an app so that you could actually carry it around with you and then see if it has any educational purpose? There's a research project, but I want to do it first. Right, now I really am going to shut up, and please explore the website. Tell me how you think we can improve it, and even wear the badge if you really want to. Thanks. Sorry, did I go?
So I think, just in the interest of time, do is that we're going to, I'll hold questions from the general audience until the end of all 3 papers. But Tim, if you want to comment after each paper, that might probably be the easiest. Now, the other thing that we didn't think about was the tech for you to be able to respond. So why don't you take my mic and then you can talk.
Presuming that I have something worthwhile listening to. Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, thanks, David. That was really fun. That was a great presentation. I think you've got some amazing materials here, and I think I don't know really where I can interject, except I hear you on the problem with using MEI, which is the musical equivalent of TEI. And I think in a lot of what we've been doing is trying to get away from these heavy tagging regimes, because exactly as you pointed out, they require a huge amount of investment of time, and they perhaps don't have the return on investment that particularly in a project such as this, where you're trying to bridge that important gap between public accessibility and academic rigor, which you're doing both at the same time, and that's a very hard place to be. But MEI is something that I think potentially will give you some return on investment, but not the kind of return that you're looking for in the immediate short run. So one of the questions that we're playing around with is, are there automatic ways that we can tag this material that will give us the same type of information? And that's coming. I think that really is, and so I think you're smart in not spending all of your time and losing all of your hair. I used to also be very, I used to have a full head of hair too at one point, and then I started working in TEI, and you probably had the same experience with working with MEI. No, unfortunately, yeah. I think that is a problem. I love this idea of the game that's an app, and that is certainly doable. And I think once you get these, what you can do is with the app is you can record user experiences, right? So the information will be coming back to you, and she'll be gaining an understanding of this app and whether or not you're learning something from it. So there are ways of making apps that also give you the information. You capture the information of what people are doing while they're doing the app. And I think that would be really interesting information. How does this early game influence the learning of music theory in this app-driven world? I think that's a great idea. I can't wait to get that so I can learn something about music theory. The pre-1750 manuscript, I think that should be something that you can align well with your 1750 to 1850 music. It seems that those will integrate well. I look forward to that as well. The online editions, you brought up this we have the same problem with literature. So in Sweden, I'm working with the Literature Bank, where they're putting all of these great Swedish works of fiction online, and they've discovered that there's a publishing house that's taking their hard-won permissions to present these online, and with all of their apparatus, and they're stripping out the apparatus and they're publishing them print on demand, and people are buying those things. So it's a real concern. I think you're smart to be aware of it. On the other hand, as a researcher, it would be really nice if there was a facility for a researcher, so you could have a researcher face and you could have a public face. And this is something that we're looking into with Litteraturbanken in Sweden, where we have a public-facing face that has limits on what you can do. And then researchers can write in and say, I would like a researcher login, and we can vet them that way. And that has certain constraints, but you could then download raw data for post-processing. And that's something that we think would be very productive, and that might be something to consider. I'm sorry to see that you're running your server off of a laptop. I've had those same kinds of experiences. And I would hope that your university has the facility to run virtual boxes.
Yes, it has. It
and
didn't when we were on the
Yeah,
project.
so
it
we've
does now.
moved all of our stuff onto virtual boxes, and we're
Yeah.
running it that way, and that allows for the university security constraints and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So we aren't outsourcing it to something like Amazon Web Services, which we did at one point as well, and still probably are using on some level. I'm not that comfortable with that, but I'm comfortable using virtual boxes. And I think it's sad to hear that you also have struggled through the same things that we've struggled through. It's like, okay, fine, I'm going to put a box, it'll be in my room, just don't unplug it. You know, so I know exactly what you've gone through. So a lovely presentation. I look forward to poking around on HMS Scott.
Great, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Go in here. The main PC. And then, sure.
So I'm going to invite Pat to come up and get herself sorted out. And we've got a microphone for her. Excellent. While I introduce her. And I did want to say too, before I introduce Pat, the other thing that you should know about David is he did the most amazing little NAFCo. I know he's all worried now. What am I going to say? The most wonderful NAFCo video. If you've not experienced these NAFCo videos, these came out of the 2015 conference at Cape Breton University, and there's a series of 13 of them. And Laura Risk, whose name keeps coming up, she's another video maker. But there's a wonderful one that David made on bass lines. That's they're very short and they're very informative, and his is very engaging. So I encourage you to find that for yourselves and take a look at it. And I'm going to introduce Pat. And I have really enjoyed getting to know Pat because she does work around Scottish traditional dancing, but also Cape Breton dancing. And seeing as how I live in Cape Breton and have been starting to do work on Cape Breton dancing myself, I'm always interested in the research that she's doing. So today, let me find, where is she? She's the first one, there we go. Okay, so Pat Ballantyne is a dance scholar and honorary research associate at the Elphinstone Institute at the University of Aberdeen, researching traditional Scottish music and dance. And her PhD thesis, completed in 2016, focuses on Scottish dancing masters and the influences that have contributed to the current state of traditional music and dance in Scotland. Pat has been dancing, teaching, and playing in a Ceilidh band for a number of years and has taught step dance in schools, at Fashion, and at community workshops. She has performed in Scotland, Europe, and in Cape Breton, where she has learned from some of the best contemporary step dancers. I'm looking forward to it, Pat.
Thank you. Like David, I'm doing another historically based investigation, except this one does not result in a website. I'll just point out here that the technology will defeat me. I have a PowerPoint presentation and my videos will not play from within the presentation. So if I can cope with this, I'm doing very well indeed. So, I'm going to start by playing you a little clip. Actually, that was probably a mistake. Never mind. Right, so that was the Highland Fling. In fact, I could probably go back to that because it illustrates what I'm starting with. It was performed at the World Championships in Cowell last year. And it's an example that you might see replicated at Highland Games all over the place, not just in Scotland. Although these dancers, 2 Californians and a Canadian, are the world champions. In each competition, dancers will strive to reach a required standard, which is dictated by a single textbook, which is used wherever Highland dancing is taught. Judges, regardless of origin, will have been trained to the same standard, sitting the same exams, and all looking for the same precise technical standards from the dancers. Highland dancing is now a highly regulated, competitive and international sport, and overseen by an influential standardising body, and has become almost a cliché of Scottishness. But just how Scottish is it? How did this highly regulated sport develop from a dance form that took its name from the Scottish Highlands? I'm going to use just one dance, the Highland Fling, in this paper, which you've just seen, to trace this story through some step descriptions of Scottish origin that have appeared over the last 200 years, and show how it's evolved from an improvisational style of dance with close connections to the music and to its cultural roots, to a globalised and competitive style with rigidly specified series of steps, less connected to the roots or to the music. There we are. In 1805, Francis Peacock, who was the official dancing master in Aberdeen in the north, which is here, of course, where you are, from 1847 to 1807, published Sketches, which was a manual for young teachers. He included a chapter describing 10 Scotch reel steps that he'd seen Gaelic-speaking Highlanders perform on many occasions. He provided a Gaelic name for each step, receiving assistance from Ewan McLaughlin, who was a renowned Gaelic scholar and at that time librarian at the University of Aberdeen. And these names placed the steps firmly in the Gaelic tradition. Peacock explained that the Highlanders were the best and most graceful dancers he had ever seen, and he expressed admiration at the ability of some young dancers to choose steps that were well suited to the music. I should note here that they would probably have danced in bare feet. Peacock explained that many Gaels came to Aberdeen to attend the universities, which suggested that he wished to impart the notion that they were more cultured than some of his contemporaries believed. Peacock also described how the dance music, the strathspeys and reels, should be interpreted, and how the dancer could put the steps, which were short 2 and 4 beat movements, or parts of these steps, together in any order, as long as the improvisations fitted closely with the tune being danced to. But why might he have devoted an entire chapter to the music and dance of the Highlanders in a manual that also discussed the minuet, dance history, philosophy, physiology, and anatomy? By the late 1700s, choreographed Highland dances were popular throughout Scotland and in England, where they were taught by such dancing masters as Thomas Wilson. In 1794, George Jenkins, a London-based dancing master, although born in Edinburgh, composed the melody "The Marquis of Huntly's Highland Fling," which became inseparable from the dance of the same name. Dancing masters travelled from England to learn the steps. Peacock may have written the chapter to ensure that the Highland provenance of the dancing and its improvisational and musical qualities were understood. Of the 10 steps he described, 2 in particular, the AHRC, or the cross-past, in which he described as being a favourite on many parts of the Highlands, and the cuirstuck, or turn, were combined to create the iconic movements associated with today's Highland Fling that we saw at the beginning of that dance that those world champions were dancing. The other Peacock steps do not appear in this dance, although variations of them can be found in 2 of the 3 other Highland dances and elsewhere. The improvisational quality of Highland dancing does not appear to have been taught by many subsequent teachers. In 1841, in rural Aberdeenshire, keen dancer Frederick Hill began to compile a notebook of instructions for dances that he had been taught by 4 itinerant dancing masters who were well known in the county. Hill noted down 2 versions of the Marquis of Huntly's Highland Fling. Both have 8 steps, being of 32 beats duration, which fits perfectly with the 8-bar measures of Strasbourg. The steps of each version and the order in which they are described are similar. The biggest difference is that one version starts with the right foot as the working foot, as Peacock describes in his descriptions, and the other with the left. In both, Peacock's Ashig Hrast with Koorstug is the 7th step, and Hill does not refer to musical interpretation. The well-known Scottish fiddler and composer James Scott Skinner spent 30 years as a dancing master. In a dance manual of 1905, he described a Marquis of Huntly's Highland Fling danced by his elder brother Sandy, himself a dancing master, who died in 1883. And this version may be roughly contemporary with Frederick Hill's. Sandy Skinner's dance had 10 steps, and Skinner describes the round the leg movement, which was that first step that you saw the champions dancing, the movement that Peacock had described as a pass in his Ashig Hrast, as a fling of the working foot around the supporting knee. He places this step as the first of the dance rather than the 7th. Like Hill, surprisingly for a well-known musician, he doesn't refer to musical interpretation. He does, however, note that a wide variety of steps and versions of the dance existed, which, he suggested, added an interest and a charm to the dance. Skinner also noted that different teachers had different methods of performing the dance, as we saw in Hill's notebook, and he hoped that the new professional society, the Imperial Society of Dancing Teachers 1904, would rectify that evil. I think he's contradicting himself a little bit here. Donald Richard Mackenzie's The National Dances of Scotland was the first such manual to be promoted by the new Imperial Society. This came out in 1910, and Mackenzie was a member of the society. He provided names and illustrations for Highland Fling steps and appears to be the first Scottish teacher to openly gender the dances as being masculine. His illustrations show a male dancer, and he instructed men to bring the working foot exactly 12 inches off the ground when dancing. I don't know how you're going to measure that. Whereas ladies, it was a bit easier for them because they were not to bring the toe of the working foot above the ankle. Mackenzie was the first commentator to suggest a suitable speed for the dance of 152 beats per minute. And I think this excerpt I'm going to show you might demonstrate this. It's from a silent film from about 1915, and it demonstrates some of the steps that Mackenzie describes in his manual. The dancer's style doesn't have any connection with the balletic influence that you saw in that first example, because the balletic influence is starting to appear at this time. This is quite lively, but it means me coming out of PowerPoint again, so we'll see how it goes. So just imagine the music. This is in the Scottish Screen Archives. There's a few wee jumps in the film. Whoops, sorry, I made a mistake there, never mind. Right. Pipe Major George Douglas Taylor's Traditional Scottish Dances was published by the Imperial Society in 1929. In a new departure, he described foot, head and arm positions, as well as the basic movements required to perform the steps, and he provided line drawings to illustrate each. He was the first commentator to describe a smooth and close round-the-leg movement for the by now standard Highland Fling step. That example you just saw, because the dancer was wearing hard shoes rather than soft shoes, she couldn't be very close round the leg. It might have been a bit painful. So they're now wearing soft shoes, they can slide round the leg. He also noted that dance steps should be executed smoothly and balletically. Taylor was assisted by Cyril Beaumont, who had transcribed the ballet master Enrico Cicchetti's exercises. Taylor's dance speeds were even faster than Mackenzie's. He's at 162 beats a minute, so you're really belting it here. It'd be great exercise. And he suggested that any strathspey would be appropriate for dancing the Highland Fling to, which is important because, again, this is a clear departure from Peacock's insistence on musical interpretation. Taylor dropped the Marquis of Huntly completely from the title, and his illustrations are of a female, perhaps because he was the piping and dancing instructor to the Dagenham Girls' Pipe Band in the London area. But this didn't go down well with some of the Highland dancing fraternity, who felt that he should have used male illustrations. Taylor's is the first publication to suggest that the dance should be performed as near as possible on the same spot. Unlike the example we've just seen, that last step I showed, she was kind of moving about a bit. And he was also the first to really specify that the soft-soled, close-fitting dancing pumps should be worn by dancers. And then after this, Donald George MacLennan, an extremely influential figure in Scottish dance, published a book of Scottish dances in 1950. With a background in ballet, he was a member of both the technical and executive committees of the Royal Academy of Dance in London. And this informed how he taught and performed Highland dancing. And he stated that his versions of the Highland Fling steps had been accepted as standard for over 50 years. And he included 4 steps of a Highland Fling from the 1880s in the book to substantiate this. His instructions for his own version are clear and exact, not so clear and exact for the older version. And he neatened and refined the dance and placed the dancers' feet closer together to aid this neatness. And like the other commentators, he provides very little musical advice other than suggesting that any good strathspey was suitable to dance to. This may be by this stage because of the availability of recorded music, which would be useful in dancing classes. And then bringing it kind of more up to date, in 1950, the Scottish Official Board of Highland Dancing was formed to regulate and control what it suggested was a chaotic situation, where Highland dances were performed differently all over Scotland. And in this, the board echoed Skinner's concern of 50 years before that. The board's aim was to standardise Highland dancing to the extent that anyone from any part of the world would perform each dance in exactly the same way. It achieved this by forming a technical committee to produce a textbook, and only the steps in the textbook could be used, and only in the described manner. And Donald MacLennan was an influential member of this committee. So the board described foot, arm and head positions, basic movements and steps, and over the years it's been in increasingly greater detail. So there's now no room for individual interpretation. And since 1955 there have been 8 editions of that textbook. The Highland dances have slowed significantly during this period. Just going back to 1955 with the first one, the Highland Fling was danced at 152 beats per minute. Today, it's performed at around 112. And this results in a dance where the dancers jump as high as possible in each step and strive for the highest possible standards of technical exercise. Indeed, a couple of dancers told me they don't hear the music, they just hear the beat because they're concentrating so hard on what their feet are doing. So, The lively improvised steps that were described, that were danced by the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders that Peacock had described, may have been appropriated by dancing masters who perhaps found it easier to teach a sequence of steps to be performed in a specific order than to teach improvisation. This resulted in a wide variety of steps and styles of performance. But contrast the lively and improvisational style of dancing with the single uniform style that's performed today by dancers of any nationality. And whilst a uniform style may enable dancers of any nationality to compete on an equal footing, lively musical interpretation, a variety of steps and styles, and perhaps even Scottishness appear that they may have been lost along the way. Thank you.
So I'm going to pass my mic over to Tim.
Okay, I'll just hold the mic. 'Cause I can't seem to clip it on. No, I'll do it one more try. Thank you very much. That was really fun. Anytime that we get. Thank you. Let's just go in there like that. There we go. Okay. I wrote a lot of notes. Yeah, I'm not sure. That was just really fun. I love that stuff, and I really like the fact that you go from an improvisational style to something that becomes more and more regimented. And I'm intrigued by this incredible regimentation of what was clearly an improvisational form. And I don't know how much recording there is or what you would learn from watching people perform exactly the same steps.
I think you can learn
over and over again.
Yeah, you can learn a lot over time because it changes so much.
That's what I was wondering. Is if we were to do it sort of at this time right now and just go to all of them in 1 year, we might not see that much. But I was wondering if there's an archive of.
Pathé News has quite a lot of just very little clips, but they're enough to let you see that even in, I think the earliest is about it's either 1910 or 1912, and even there you can see different styles
fabulous,
going.
Because then once you've got this historical thing, then you can actually start to do things with it. And then I think one of the interesting things that will then come up is doing this motion analysis, where you can get consistent features in motion. They're not moving around a lot. They might be earlier on, but you would actually capture that too. And so we've been looking at ways of overlapping different types of, in this case, music videos, and seeing where what kinds of jitter we get over, n number of music videos. And that might give you an ability to see what things are stable and what things aren't stable with just in a visualization, without having to do any additional analysis. So that might be something to look into. Other than that, I mean, this is really fascinating to see one of these. So I've worked a little bit with cultural properties preservation, mostly in Korea, where they have a government agency that's called the Bureau of Cultural Properties Preservation. That's what it's called. And we went around. I was on a shaman certification squad, so we would go around and we would we would certify shamans for potential inclusion as living national treasures. And they wanted sort of a sense of how far they were deviating from what they thought was the ideal form of shaman ritual X or Y. And it was completely spurious kinds of analysis that they wanted us to undertake to see whether or not they wanted to, in fact, turn these people into living national treasures. Who would then perform these intangible cultural properties again and again in this set fashion. And it was really interesting to see the internal resistance of the shamans to this, and at the same time their desire to get this recognition, because if they got the recognition, they got a degree of status. And I wonder, ethnographically, just talking to some of these dancers, how much they would like to. I mean, do they occasionally, like in in secret, turn on their favorite reel and improvise?
Yeah, they do.
And
Yeah,
maybe
some
not
of-
even as
some of
secretly.
them, Some of them definitely do. Yeah,
And that would be kind of
thoroughly
interesting
enjoy
then
it.
to see,
Yeah.
what kinds of improvisations they do in comparison to their more regimented dancing.
Those I've spoken to are
Yeah.
pretty complex.
Yeah, well, that would be really also interesting to see, that, comparing the improvised dance to the non-improvised dance. And that might be another fun area where you get a lot of very interesting information. So that's about all I can say
Thank
about
you.
that, but I really find this fascinating. Lovely stuff.
Thank you so much, Tim. Sorry, I'm just thinking as Tim's talking, it makes me think a little bit of, I have a good friend, I don't know whether she's watching us online or not, Sherry Johnson, who does work on the Ottawa Valley tradition in Canada. And she's looked a lot at the competition dancing, step dancing, and how it's not regulated the way Highland dancing is, but of course competition puts all sorts of pressures on the dance. But then there's a campground, and the campground is a much more informal social space, and the kinds of differences that happen in the fiddle playing and the dancing, same people performing in the campsite versus the competitive stage. So anyway, it just made me think of that as you said that. So we've got Gaila, I hope. Come on up and you can get your microphone and get your technology set up. And I'm going to read Gaila Kirdienė's information. So she's Associate Professor and Senior Researcher at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre. She holds a master's degree in violin and ethnomusicology, and she has a PhD in ethnology. She has had research stays in a number of different institutes, and her research emphasizes Lithuanian folk fiddling and music making by Soviet deportees and political prisoners in Siberia. She's the author of a couple of different books, and she's going to be talking to us today about ebooks, and she has a DVD to her name, the Anthology of Lithuanian Folk Fiddle Music. And most recently, she's the co-author of Lithuanians and Music in Siberia in 2013, and all of her works are in both Lithuanian with English summaries. She plays fiddle and other Lithuanian traditional musical instruments, and she's the leader of a traditional musical group. So are you all sorted there? Perfect. Then we've got Gaila. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm very glad that I can introduce you and my colleagues created digital books, and some of them I brought here, and some of them are available only online. It's very comfortable and convenient to take it on a travel, on trip, and maybe you would like to have a look. So. Since 2003, digital books of folklore, including music, dance, and folklore, and vocal folklore, customs, and other related branches of intangible cultural heritage, are being published in Lithuania. At the same time, computer and internet databases of Lithuanian folklore have been starting to be created. In all cases, it's teamwork, combining intellects both of humanities and computer programming to find common understanding and solutions, and to embody or fulfill humanitarian visions by technological and computer programs means. At this time, we already had a digital publishing house in Vilnius established in 1998 and led by a famous historian, Eugenijus Jovaiša, who first started creating digital handbooks or tutorials of history for school children, paying attention to their interactivity and usage of multimedia. In his words, they replaced mountains of the printed books. And I could add, they replaced a huge amount of audiovisual data. It's also important that young programists were raised here, specialized in digital humanitarian books. I've been a co-author of 3 this house published digital folklore books dedicated for school children and their teachers for their self-teaching. I was responsible for all musical and choreographic folklore. Later on, I was cooperating in creating of a book for students, and I was responsible for instrumental folklore. And in 2015, I published a book of Lithuanian, not a book actually, it's like a DVD, authorized with authoring of Lithuanian folk fiddle music anthology. It could be mentioned that my first database on Lithuanian folk fiddlers I have created actually together with cooperation proposed by a friend of mine, scientific fellow of the Lithuanian Institute of Mathematics and Maths and Informatics, and we just did that for fun, but I still have it at home, like historical now. So a reminiscence about my first database. It includes data, so metadata I would say now, of about 500 folk fiddlers from Lithuania. And I have also cooperated in creating and of computerized and internet musical folklore databases since 2003, which are still available and are being still creating online. And one could state that digital books, otherwise than databases, are completed works founded on cultural and or scientific concepts in which there are selected folklore examples, illustrations, audio and video recordings, transcriptions, and related audio-visual and or more visual materials to the stated ideas by the authors. These specified materials can be easily accessed both from activated references in the rather short and concentrated text chapters for reading, or used as separate collections, which usually are considerably larger than those of printed paper books. The greatest challenge for all of the team members was and still would be now to create their book as much attractive, vivid, animated, widely accessible and transmitted for the contemporary users to the youth audience. And therefore, we have always used not only old archival, but also recent or contemporary materials. Quite often they were personally collected also by myself. And our aim was to show continuity and vitality of the discussed phenomena and issues today. It's a huge work, and therefore what sometimes is my fear that we can lose these books or maybe also data because of due to the persistent continual improvements of the computer programs or damage of the storage devices. And of course, when now after some 15 years I look back to these books, I think that maybe not in structure and in shape and layout and design, maybe they could be improved and improved, because the new generation has come, and their demands and imaginations are already different. They don't like reading at all. They like computer games, and these books, they don't have any computer games or interactive tasks, but of course these concepts and the content, what we could call, It won't lose the actuality. They will be of value, I think, still many years. And just to be short, I just show you first of our book. It's called Gyvūnijos pasaulis etninėje kultūroje. That means the world of animals in the ethnic culture, because it's pivoted on the idea of the relations of animals and calendar festivals and all folklore. And therefore, I show just, you can see here the chapters. It's introduction, it's about animals, it's about spring festivals, autumn festivals, and so on. And here you can see collections of audio video recordings, and the notations or transcriptions. I'm not sure if they would show now me. Yeah, they show. You have them quite many there. You can print it and learn from the written notes. We have how many? I don't remember anymore. How many? Oh, it's 82 here. Okay, so. But you can choose, for example, the days of birds, because in spring in Lithuania the birds are coming back, and when we are talking about instrumental music, of course it's a very beautiful and old tradition to imitate the voices of the birds, and therefore I have photographed children who were playing on clay whistles and children ensembles of skudučiai, which are also imitating bird voices. And for example, these small, nice children. And also contemporary masters who were making whistles, like from modern technologies like this one. I still have it at home. It's very nice, and it's made with a sour of bread, what we make of rye, not white, but dark one. Or maybe to have imagination what very ancient instruments like this for locking of birds are used in hunting. And for example, if you look to yeah, I cannot find it now. Oh. Okay, for audio recordings, then you find some like this. Oh, no, I still have to. Do they show you? They don't, I'm sorry. It should be, I know, it's audio, it's okay. It's imitation of a lark. It was photograph of children playing in a string band originally, but something happened with technologies and you cannot see it because I know already by heart that it should be here. And also another, it could be used also, these examples, for example, from the beginning, they could be used as a game. To guess what voice do you hear, like this one. It's played by a birchbark. What bird is it? You have it. I hope so. It's a nightingale. Okay, and because we just have had Easter, I'd like to show you some examples of Easter. And of course, the musical instruments like this, and children playing. And we have very beautiful customs, which school children had. Oh, can it go down? What's the problem now? What they are also doing, they are learning folklore pieces, not only like for concerts, but they are doing it in the whole activity. They are making their celebrations. And for example, this celebration of swinging, because we have a special custom of swinging in spring time. And for example, this one, very beautiful, but you won't see it. It's very bit. We had maybe checked this before. Or maybe I could show you from this maybe it would show from the disk. If you would give me it, this one, this larger one, please. Oh. Let's try. Oh, I don't know. Would you help me, please, with this? Because it was what I wanted to show you. And you know, with visual materials you have, yeah. It seemed that I have checked a lot before, but still it was not sufficient. Let's try. It takes some time, and it would be maybe desirable that it would be fast always, or we also have always problems with Lithuanian letters. Now let's try if we are lucky. No, not this one. What's going here? Yeah, or maybe the next one from this. Okay. So, and I would like to show you, okay, then I skip the newest one book because it's for students, it's similar, it's of course it was our preference to keep the same programmist, but design is just a little bit different. And I would like to show you how my anthology looks. It's you know it already. Where to put it? Oh, not to shut it off at all, I don't know. Too many buttons. you know that the most funny thing it's maybe that I'm entirely humanitarian. I'm not a digital person, but still the life made me to publish so many books. Okay. Because it's what now our life nowadays demands, actually, or we think so. What to do with this one? Yeah, let's try. You see, we divided it's about 154 recordings, what I have selected. I, of course, had to take care about filming some of them, and they are divided according to the regions, and they are sort the whole, this anthology, it's more sort like dedicated as for the books, like edition or collection, because I've written pretty many books about fiddling, but they need in audio and video recordings. And just one recording from this book, for example, like this one. Yeah, I could mention also that when I published this, I was very surprised that the Lithuanian television came to me, and they made a report about it in the evening news for culture, so in the chapter for culture, and they said, oh, it's so interesting that you published such a folk fiddle music book. It's very not. She said not interesting. She says it's so funny, it's so good, so desirable. But she was from the world of the classical music, actually. But it's good to see that this understanding of folk culture, of traditional culture, is also important for people from other spheres. Thank you.
Now I've got it. Great, thank you, Gaila. That's really remarkable books that you've managed to put together there, and I think this is one of the things, the challenges that we keep confronting is how to bring our materials to a wider audience and make it accessible, and then also make it persevere. I mean, one of the problems is that the technology changes so fast that our materials all of a sudden become obsolete almost when we publish them. So one of the things I've struggled with is that my book came with a DVD, and 2 years later Macintosh decided that no more DVDs, they said. Damn it. And so this is kind of a continuing struggle. It seems that you've managed to begin to bridge that quite well. I think one of the things that we can do is if we have our data and we keep it in a relatively accessible format that we keep in our research collections, we can then pump it out in different formats for different purposes. And it looks like you're succeeding quite well in that, with saying, here are some things that are for popular audiences, here are things that are for educational purposes, and then here are things for research purposes. And it's all driven by the same data. We were experimenting with this in various encyclopedic projects where we thought would have a basic level where you could come in, and if you were a K-12 learner, that's what we call students in primary and secondary school. If you're a K-12 learner, you would have different needs than, say, somebody who's a college student or a university student or a researcher. And so there would be different levels of access to the underlying material. And so this is where actually XML and TEI and probably MEI could be useful in a limited sense, because you could write a style sheet that says, oh, for this website we're going to pump it out with these parameters, and then we can add a little button that says open it up now to the more advanced level, and then you could open it up to the expert level. So there's something that is doable there. As a researcher, I'm mostly just interested. Give me the data. I mean, it's sort of I've got it tattooed on my back. But for a lot of people, there has to be this wonderful context, and I just think it's delightful to see that you've got examples of the playing, you've got the videos, and you've also got these rich texts. I hear you on that problem of pushing a button and not getting the video. I experience that all the time. It drives me nuts. You'd think those damn computer scientists could figure it out, but even they have that exact same problem. They push the button, they're like, oh, I don't know, it's not working. This is something that we have to be aware of, and that's one of the challenges. How do I keep my material accessible and yet make it available, right? And so those two things aren't necessarily the same thing. Accessible and available are sometimes different things, and they are in a fight with each other. This is something that hats off to you. I think it's great that you're pumping it out and getting it out into the hands of people, and the newspapers and the TV news are coming and interviewing you. I think that's absolutely wonderful. The only thing I'm missing is my Lithuanian is really bad, and so I have a very hard time reading this. And so maybe that's another thing that we could think about, is how do we get international scholars to translate and to work across languages.
But it's being done already. It's been doing, because our last book is it has two versions actually, in Lithuanian and in English, and we also we are taking part at international projects like Europeana Sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
wonderful. That's great. Thank you very much.
All right. So at this point, we've had a wonderful set of 3 papers, and Tim's so appreciative of you being able to respond to each of those on the fly like that. That's really helpful just to hear some different ideas about approaching these different projects. We do have just a few minutes for questions. So if there are questions for any of the presenters, then I hope you'll speak up, or perhaps, I don't know whether we have any online questions, not at the moment, but if anybody in the Twitter sphere would like to tweet a question to #NAFCo Workshop 2, then you're certainly welcome to. But are there any questions for any of the 3 presenters today? Oh, David's got one. I'm gonna bring you my mic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've got a question for Pat, actually. Sorry. I'm amazed that the official board for Highland dancing didn't appear until 1955, because people tried to do the same thing for fiddle music and failed in sort of 1810s, and it never worked because it's impossible. And round about the same time, of course, they were trying to do the same thing with piping, and that held and that worked, and it became very standardized. Why do you think it took so long, another 140 years, before they did it with Highland dancing?
So I'll bring over a mic so that, and Pat, do you want to come up, just because then the cameras will be able to see you as well. So you can just hold that if you like.
Hold that.
Sure, if you wish.
Can you hear me? The 20th century was when the influential dance societies started to be formed. There had been dance societies beforehand. They started as to protect members' business interests. And it was as a result, the ISTD that I mentioned throughout the paper, that the Mackenzie book, the Taylor book, the ISTD was to cover the interests of all British dancing teachers. And in the 1930s, some of the Scottish dancing teachers felt that the ISTD wasn't serving their interests. And they split and formed the Scottish Dance Teachers Association. And it was the aim of this association from the 1930s that wanted the Highland dancing regulation brought in. Another society beat the formation of the Scottish Official Board of Highland Dancing, which was like 1950-ish. In the very late 40s, the Scottish Official Highland Dancing Association was formed. But I think they didn't have quite the same membership. The official board, this is the big guys, right? They had country dancing, they had pipers, they had ballet, they had representatives from you name it on their board deciding how dance was going to move forward in future. So I think it was just a quite slow and steady progress. It wasn't quick by any means. The whole movement must have taken about 80 years anyway. And it started off as a business interest preservation more than anything else.
Thank you. Oh, I've got another question. Just hang on. I'm going to go over there.
My question for you is about the outfits and the education of the children. I noticed they were all wearing what I'm assuming was Lithuanian traditional costumes. Yeah, and I was curious about how the education system through the government, like how top-down that folklorizing process is. I phrased that really badly, so do your best with that.
You mean the nowadays situation about this folklore education?
Yeah, because
at
school children today in their outfits, yeah?
You mean, or what was the question? Why they are wearing these costumes, or what?
Yeah.
Why?
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has a traditional costume. But there are still some children in the villages who maybe have their grandparents' costumes, especially female, so that means of women, because men, they were, this tradition was transmitted not so good of the costume. But also you saw these very, very simple costumes. You saw them like of linen white. And it's very, very simple to do, and it's very comfortable in summer. You don't, because for filming or for something, for some it's seen also maybe like a performance, and you have you need some performance costume or wearing, and that's why they have to have some traditional, if traditional music, then traditional dress.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe time for one more question? Ian's got a question.
A question for David. David, you did the snapper on the basing. Could you just sort of, for those of us who haven't watched it, I have watched it, but for those who haven't watched it, just tell us, give us a taste of what you were trying to demonstrate in that snapper, video.
Without being able to sing the tunes and hum the bass lines at the same time, it's quite hard. But it's a combination of demonstrating that there's a very clear style of 4 beats on the floor, bass lines on the cello for Strathspey's reels from about 1760 to beginning of the 20th century. And that idea of 4 on the floor, that was the best thing to dance to. It was really, really strong. But it didn't mean that every tune always had the same bass line. And I found that there's a wonderful tune, Invercoll's Rant, that appears in quite a few books from about 1760s onwards. And I found 4 completely different bass lines that one even puts it in a different key, with totally different understandings of what the harmonic structure, if you like, or the tonal structure of the tune is. So it's like they're clearly quite early on. There wasn't one sense in people's heads of, yeah, this is the framework for these tunes. Already it was becoming quite diverse, and the influence of the piano and chords were coming in. People didn't play chords for tunes until well into the 19th century. And so everything's constantly changing, which is great. And Nathaniel Guy tries to standardize the tunes, you know, to standardize our national music and make it all nice and clean and tidy. And of course, and a few years later says, yes, and we've mostly achieved this, and nonsense. It just didn't work at all, which is great. And of course, with piping, with a bit of help from the military, the standardization really took hold. But bass lines, although there was that underlying style, there wasn't a standardization of harmonic practice really. But you can observe trends quite easily. I think that's it.
Thank you. Oh, we have one more. I'm just going to say as well too that you can find the NAFCo snappers on Vimeo, so you can do a search for David's snapper video, and they're also on the NAFCo Facebook page. And maybe we can get Jenny to retweet that code for the Facebook post. Maybe it would be a good thing we could do. All right, Colin, we got like 1 minute, so
only 1 minute.
Fast question.
I just wanted to thank Ian for that question because it reminded me of something I wanted to ask about the Scottish bassline project and the making that music danceable again. And I had the pleasure of hearing the band play, and talking to your cello player was really fascinating. And there were so many similarities to what she was doing to what continues in string band music in Central Europe, where playing those instruments as an ensemble for dancing, you know, has had a lot of continuity. I'm wondering, did you take any comparisons, or did you look into, you know, the way of playing? Say the one people would know most would be the sort of Transylvanian, Hungarian string ensembles.
At the beginning of the project, yeah, we desperately wanted to, because that was the Hungarian one. Was oh, this is so clearly, and where you have the bass part of the string ensemble is part of the whole overall thing. And we thought, oh great, there's going to be terrific parallels there. And we just never had time. There were always so many other things to do. They are there. So yes, and I really want to explore it, but we got so caught up in the material that we had that that bit didn't happen. But I wish it had. Thanks.
So I know that Ian has some instructions for those of us that are in the room, but for those who are watching us online via live stream, or perhaps later through the archive, then we appreciate you attending very much today. And we're very grateful to the AHRC funding that we received to make this possible. And I hope that we'll see you all, whether in person or on live stream, at the next workshop in October 4th to 6th at Cape Breton University. So thank you very much for all of you for being here, and perhaps another round of applause for our wonderful presenters today, and for Tim for his feedback. So I'll hand this over to Ian for last instructions, but
I don't think I need the microphone.
then
now.
very much. Thank you very much.
Offline now.
Thank you.
The live streaming's all over. I can take my jacket off.